The morning sun cast fractured shards of colored light across the marble floors of the prestigious music school. Each beam refracted through the stained glass windows their intricate patterns, depicting musical notes and historical maestros painting the silent halls with vibrant neon colors that glowed softly in the stillness. The school was a sanctuary of sound, but paradoxically, a place where silence was sacred. She was part of this world, yet utterly apart from it. Born mute, she had never known the sound of her own voice. But here, in this institution, the silence was imposed on all. Outside performances, speech was forbidden, a rule as absolute as the notes pressed into the scores she practiced daily. The silence pressed down on her like a weight, heavier than most could bear. For Elara, it was a double confinement, one of circumstance, the other of decree. She paused briefly in the grand entrance hall, a cathedral-like space where portraits of past maestros lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. Students passed by with downcast eyes, their faces masks of concentration and restraint. No laughter, no whispers, no casual greetings. Only the soft rustle of sheet music and the occasional distant tuning of instruments punctuated the stillness. Elara's dark hair was pulled back into a neat braid, her observant eyes scanning the faces she encountered. Though she did not speak, her mind was a torrent of thoughts and feelings, melodies and rhythms that words could never capture. Music was her language, the only one that could convey the depths of her soul. She made her way to the practice rooms, each a small sanctuary where sound was allowed to bloom. The heavy oak door of the piano room creaked softly as she entered, the familiar scent of polished wood and felt warming her. Inside, the grand piano waited, its black lacquer gleaming under the low light. Elara sat, her fingers hovering momentarily above the keys, feeling the quiet hum of the room. Her mind filled with notes, fragments of melodies she had dreamed and composed in silence. Slowly, her fingers began to move, coaxing a gentle tune from the instrument. The sound was pure, unbroken by words or speech, yet it spoke volumes. It was a voice that could not be silenced, even here. Outside, the school's authority was embodied by Headmaster Corwin. His tall, austere figure cut a commanding presence in the halls. Silver hair framed his stern face, and his piercing eyes missed nothing. To him, silence was a vessel of discipline and artistic purity, essential to the cultivation of true musicianship. Conversations and idle chatter were distractions to be rooted out, and he enforced the silence rule with unwavering resolve. Elara was no stranger to his gaze. Though she never challenged him openly, his presence was a constant reminder of the boundaries that confined her. In the shadows, Professor Lyle watched over the students, a strict enforcer of rules, yet with a subtle softness in his eyes when they met Elara's. He understood the burden she bore, though he said nothing. His conflicted loyalty added layers to the institution's rigid facade. Sophie, the flutist, moved like a shadow through the corridors, her sharp eyes and whispered rumors stitching threads of tension among the students. She was both a source of unease and a reminder of the fragile social dynamics that played out in silence. Elara's world was one of contrasts between sound and silence, isolation and longing, obedience and the faint stirrings of defiance. Each day she navigated the invisible walls around her, her internal melodies growing louder even as her lips remained sealed. She paused by a window, watching her peers move like ghosts through the halls. Their eyes rarely met. Their hands, when not clutching instruments, were folded tightly or hidden in pockets. The silence rule was more than a policy, it was a barrier, an unspoken agreement that kept them apart. Yet, in that quiet, Elara sensed possibilities. Within the unyielding stillness, there were cracks, small, tentative gestures, shared glances, and music that whispered truths beyond words. Her fingers brushed the piano keys again, and she imagined a world where silence was not a cage, but a canvas, where sound could be more than notes on a page, could be a bridge connecting isolated hearts. As the bell tolled softly, signaling the start of the day's lessons, Elara rose with a quiet resolve. The silent halls could hold her voice no longer. Somewhere, beyond the strict rules and watchful eyes, a new melody awaited, and she was ready to play it. The school bell echoed faintly, a gentle chime swallowed quickly by the vast silence. Elara's shadow stretched long across the marble floor as she stepped forward into the day, carrying with her the first notes of a silent revolution. Elara's mornings began with the muted clatter of footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors of the prestigious music school. The halls were always immaculate, bathed in a pale morning light that sifted through tall windows, casting long shadows along the walls. The air was thick with a rigid stillness, a silence that was more than the absence of sound. It was a decree, an invisible barrier that cloaked every corner and crevice of the institution. The silence rule was absolute. No speaking outside of performance. This was the sacred law of the school, handed down from generations past, believed to preserve artistic purity and focus. But for Elara, born mute, this rule was a double-edged sword. It offered a strange kind of safety in its uniformity, but also deepened the chasm of her isolation. Each morning she found herself drawn to the practice rooms, the sanctuaries where music breathed and stretched in defiance of the silence. Today was no different. The door to the grand piano stood slightly ajar, the polished black surface gleaming under the soft light. Elara slipped inside, the quiet click of the latch the only sound she made. She settled onto the bench, the cool leather creaking beneath her, and let her fingers hover momentarily above the keys. Then, with a deliberate tenderness, she began to play. The melody was delicate, a soft cascade of notes that wove through the still air, speaking volumes in the absence of words. Each chord was a brushstroke painting the contours of her inner world, longing, frustration, hope, and the faintest glimmer of defiance. The music was her language, richer and more nuanced than any spoken phrase could be. As the final note faded, Elara's eyes lifted to the window. Outside, students moved silently like shadows, their footsteps muffled against the stone. She thought of their faces, so many masked behind expressions of disciplined compliance. They navigated the halls like ghosts, their voices locked away as securely as her own. Later, in the main corridor, Elara's gaze caught movement. Theo, the percussionist known among the students for his light-hearted antics, was threading his way through the crowd. His tousled hair bounced with each step, and a hint of a smile played at the corner of his lips, though his eyes remained watchful. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shared burden of silence. Elara's pulse quickened. In this world of muted existence, such moments were precious. They were the threads of connection she desperately sought. Classes passed in a blur of silent gestures and careful attention. Professor Lyle, the stern music instructor and enforcer of the silence rule, paced the room with an almost predatory precision. His sharp eyes scanned the students, ensuring no breath escaped their lips outside of rehearsals. Yet, beneath his austere exterior, Elara sensed a flicker of sympathy whenever their gazes met, a complicated allegiance that gave her a fragile sense of hope. During breaks, Elara retreated to the solitude of her dormitory, The small lamp on her desk cast a soft halo of light as she scribbled notes to herself. Her handwriting was neat but hurried, the pages filled with fragments of thoughts, musical ideas, and moments of quiet rebellion. These notes were a lifeline away to articulate what her music could not fully convey. Despite the oppressive silence, Elara's world was alive with unspoken melodies and vivid emotions. She watched, listened, and learned the subtle language of gestures, the tilt of a head, the arch of an eyebrow, the fleeting flash of a smile. Each became a thread in the intricate tapestry of communication she wove around herself. Yet, the weight of the silence rule pressed heavily on her spirit. The school's rigid discipline was unyielding, and the consequences for breaking the rule were severe. Still, Elara's fingers itched to create, to speak, to reach beyond the walls that confined her. The day's final rehearsal was a study in controlled tension. The students moved with precision, their instruments poised like extensions of their own bodies. Elara sat at the piano, her heart thudding in her chest. The silence around her was suffocating, but as her fingers touched the keys, the room blossomed with sound. Her music was a conversation without words, a delicate dance of emotion and restraint. And in those moments, Elara found a fleeting freedom of space where silence and sound intertwined to express what words could not. As the echoes of the last chord faded, Elara caught a glimpse of Sophie, the flutist and notorious school gossip, watching her with a calculating gaze. The tension in the room shifted imperceptibly, a reminder that beneath the surface, the rules were both shield and shackle. Returning to her dorm, Elara lay awake beneath the pale moonlight, the melodies of the day playing softly in her mind. The silence outside was complete, but inside her chest, a quiet rebellion stirred a promise that one day the unspoken would become heard. Elara's journey had only just begun. Elara sat in the corner of the practice room, the late afternoon light filtering through the tall windows in soft golden shafts. The polished floorboards gleamed faintly beneath her, reflecting the shimmering notes of dust dancing in the air. Around her, the room was suffused with silence, broken only by the occasional distant tremor of a violin or the measured breath of a fellow student at the piano. Her fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the small, worn notebook she had hidden beneath her music sheets. The edges of the pages were frayed, and the ink inside was smudged in places where her hands had faltered or her thoughts had spilled over too quickly. She brought the notebook closer and began to write, the pen scratching softly against the paper. Notes to herself, fragments of thoughts, feelings too complex and tangled to voice. Words she could never speak aloud, not because of the school's rules, but because her voice had never been hers to use. Each letter was a small rebellion, a crack in the wall of silence that surrounded her. "I am here," she wrote, the phrase simple yet charged with meaning. "I see, I feel, I want to speak." The act of writing was both a comfort and a torment. It gave form to the swirling emotions inside her, but it also reminded her of everything she could not say. She glanced up as footsteps echoed softly down the hall. A shadow passed the doorway mirror, the violinist with the freckled face and the short, curly hair, who always seemed to move with a restless energy that defied the school's oppressive stillness. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was something unspoken in Myra's gazer, flicker of recognition, a quiet challenge to the silence. Elara felt a flicker of something new, hope. Later, Elara folded one of her notes carefully and slipped it beneath the edge of a music sheet on her stand. The paper was a secret message, a tiny spark thrown into the vast darkness. She wondered if anyone would ever find it, if anyone would ever understand the words she could not voice. As the days passed, Elara found herself watching Mira more closely. The violinist's subtle gestures, the way she would sometimes touch her instrument with a small defiance. The brief glances that seemed to say, "We are not alone." It was a silent conversation, carried on in the spaces between the notes. In the quiet corners of the school, where voices were forbidden and emotions were locked behind a code of silence, these small acts of rebellion grew like seedlings pushing through concrete. Elara began to feel the stirrings of connection, fragile but undeniable. The notebook in her hands was no longer just a repository for her solitude, was the first step towards something more. She was not alone. And maybe, just maybe, the silence was not unbreakable. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the practice room floor. Elara closed her notebook gently and looked toward the doorway once more. Mira was gone, but the echo of her presence lingered, a promise of quiet defiance waiting to bloom. The silence remained, but within it, a new melody was beginning to take shape, one written not in words, but in the notes between lines, in the spaces where emotions dared to breathe. The afternoon light filtered softly through the tall windows of the music school's practice hall, casting long, muted shadows on the polished wooden floor. Elara sat quietly at the piano, her fingers poised just above the keys, yet hesitant. Around her, other students practiced in strict silence, their movements precise and controlled, their expressions carefully guarded. The school's sacred rule was clear: no speaking outside of performance. Even a whisper was forbidden, a rule imposed to preserve the purity of music and discipline. For Elara, whose voice had never sounded, this rule felt like an additional shackle, one that deepened the chasm between her and the others. She was mute by birth, accustomed to speaking through her music, but the enforced silence made every day feel heavier. Her eyes, however, were always alert, observing the world she could not speak in. Today, her gaze settled on Mira, a violinist whose short curls bounced as she played, her freckled face alive with an expression that seemed to challenge the very walls of the school. Mira's bow moved with a rebellious grace, coaxing notes that were both tender and fierce, as if she was speaking a language all her own. Elara felt a flutter of recognition, the same yearning she harbored to break free from the invisible chains. Mira's lips twitched into a slight smile, and Elara found herself returning it with a nod, subtle but deliberate. This small exchange was dangerous in a place where silence was law, yet it felt like the first fragile thread connecting her isolated world to someone else's. Over the following days, the two found themselves drawn into the same spaces during practice and meals, their glances lingering longer than customary, their gestures growing more intentional. One such note depicted a musical staff with a heart drawn over it, a quiet declaration of shared spirit. Mira responded with a barely perceptible thumbs up and a wink, signaling her readiness to embrace whatever subtle rebellion Elara was willing to undertake. Their silent conversation was a balm to Elara's solitude, a delicate promise of friendship that did not rely on words. Yet, beneath the hopeful connection, tension simmered. Both knew that any misstep could lead to punishment, and the school's strict enforcers, especially Professor Lyle, watched closely for signs of dissent. But the risk only sharpened their resolve. In the dining hall, amid the clatter of utensils and the faint murmur of footsteps, Elara and Mira exchanged a glance that said more than words could. It was an unspoken vow to support each other, to find meaning beyond the oppressive quiet. Elara's heart, often heavy with isolation, felt lighter. For the first time since arriving at the school, she sensed the possibility of belonging. As the day faded into evening, Elara sat alone at the piano, her fingers finally pressing down on the keys to release a melody both tentative and bold. Each note was a silent message to Mira, to herself, to the world, a beginning. The first connection had been made, and with it, a quiet revolution began to stir in the depths of the school's silence. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the headmaster's office, casting elongated shadows across the polished oak floor. Headmaster Corwin stood silently by the window, his tall frame imposing against the muted light. His silver hair caught the glow, stark against the dark suit he wore with impeccable precision. His piercing eyes scanned the silent courtyard below, where students moved with practiced restraint, their lips sealed by the institution's sacred edict. Corwin's gaze was unwavering, but inside, a storm brewed one he refused to acknowledge. To him, silence was not merely a rule, but the very essence of artistic purity. It was a discipline forged through decades, a tradition that shaped not only the school's identity, but the quality of music that emerged from its halls. He believed that words outside performance diluted the emotional focus, fracturing the delicate tension necessary for true expression. Yet, as he watched the students, his mind flickered to the recent murmurs, whispers of dissent, small acts of rebellion that threatened the order he had painstakingly cultivated. Among them was Elara, the mute pianist, whose very presence challenged the institution's assumptions about silence. Though she spoke no words, her fingers wove melodies that spoke volumes, and her subtle gestures hinted at emotions the school had long sought to suppress. Corwin took his place at the head of the long table, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the assembled instructors. "The silence rule is not a mere formality," he began, eyes locking with each member present. "It is the foundation upon which this school stands. Without it, our discipline, our focus, and ultimately our music will falter." The room was heavy with unspoken tension. Some faculty members exchanged furtive glances, aware of the growing undercurrents among the students. Professor Lyle, ever the enforcer, nodded solemnly, though a flicker of sympathy softened his typically stern features. He had observed Elara closely, recognizing the unique challenges her muteness presented under such oppressive rules. Corwin's words left no room for doubt or debate. The silence was inviolable, yet beneath his austere exterior, doubt lingered a shadow he buried deep. The emotional cost, the isolation bred by these rules, was a price he deemed necessary, though not without occasional pangs of regret. Meanwhile, in the quiet refuge of an empty rehearsal hall, Elara sat at the grand piano. Her delicate fingers traced the keys with a reverence born of years of solitude and sound. The notes floated through the expansive room, a haunting melody that seemed to reach beyond the physical silence, carrying her unspoken thoughts and feelings. The contrast between the music's warmth and the school's cold silence was stark, a reminder of the invisible barriers that confined her. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, revealing her observant eyes that flickered with a quiet defiance. In this space, she was free, her music a language that transcended the institution's rigid rules. Yet, as the final notes lingered in the air, the weight of the school's expectations settled back upon her shoulders. In the corridor outside, fate orchestrated a brief but charged encounter. Corwin's path crossed with Elara's, and their eyes met a silent exchange heavy with meaning. The headmaster's expression was stern, a visible reminder of the authority he wielded. Elara's gaze, however, held a quiet challenge, a testament to her growing resolve to break through the emotional walls that bound them all. The clash was subtle but profound, tradition against change, authority against quiet defiance. It marked a turning point, foreshadowing the tensions that would soon ripple through the school's hallowed halls. As night draped itself over the campus, the silence remained unbroken on the surface. Yet beneath, a current of unrest stirred, carried on the wings of Elara's melodies and the whispered hopes of those who longed for a different way. The weight of tradition was immense, but the first cracks had begun to show. And in those cracks, the fragile promise of transformation whispered softly, waiting for the moment to bloom. The chapter closes with Corwin retreating to his office, the silence around him both a shield and a cage. Outside, Elara's music lingers, a beacon of hope and quiet defiance that will challenge the very foundation of the school's creed. What will happen when the weight of tradition meets the unstoppable force of change? The school holds its breath. The corridors of the music school whispered with the weight of unspoken words. But today, something different flickered beneath the usual stillness, a quiet rebellion brewing in the shadows. Elara moved through the halls with her usual careful grace, her dark hair tied back tightly, eyes always alert, absorbing the silent language that governed this place. The rule was absolute: no speaking outside of performances, a silence so strict that even a whisper felt like a betrayal. Yet, in the sanctuary of her mind, Elara's thoughts sang in vivid colors and melodies. It was during a late afternoon rehearsal session that Mira found her. The violinist's short curls bounced as she approached Elara with a glint of mischief and warmth in her expressive eyes. Myra's presence was a stark contrast to the rigid quietude around them. She embodied a restless spirit, a yearning for something beyond the imposed silence. "You feel it too, don't you?" Mira's eyes asked the question without a sound, a silent invitation to share in a secret defiance. Elara's gaze softened, a flicker of trust passing between them. She nodded slightly, her fingers twitching as if to play an unseen chord. In the practice room, Myra's energy was contagious. She hummed softly, a barely audible melody that danced just beneath the threshold of the school's strict rules. It was a small act, but in this place it was revolutionary. Elara's heart quickened not with fear, but with the thrilling possibility of connection. Myra's rebellion was not loud or brash. It was a tender defiance, a seed planted in the fertile soil of quiet desperation. Elara's hands found the piano keys, hesitant at first, then surer, pouring her emotions into a melody that spoke without words. Each note was a brushstroke painting the canvas of her internal landscape: longing, frustration, courage. The music was her voice, breaking the silence in ways the school could not punish. As days passed, Mira's subtle provocations became a balm for Elara's isolation. They exchanged glances filled with unspoken understanding, their silent conversations growing richer and more daring. Theo, the percussionist known for his light-heartedness, joined their quiet circle, offering support in small, unassuming ways. His presence was a reminder that rebellion could be gentle and that solidarity could form in the most unlikely places. Yet, the shadow of authority loomed. Professor Lyle's watchful eyes missed nothing, his strict adherence to the silence rule clashing with the faint sympathy he held for Elara's plight. Sophie's sharp gaze and whispered rumors threatened to unravel the fragile threads of their growing resistance. In the hidden corners of the school, a current stirred a creative tension that was both exhilarating and dangerous. Elara felt it in the tightening of her chest, the quickening of her breath as she dared to push boundaries. The silence that once suffocated now trembled with possibility. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, Myra slipped a folded note into Elara's hand. It simply read, "Not alone." That brief message ignited a spark. Elara understood then that their fight was not just against a rule, but for the right to be heard in the deepest sense, to connect beyond words, beyond silence. The chapter closes on Elara sitting at the piano in an empty hall, her fingers poised above the keys, ready to strike the first note of a new melody, one that would echo far beyond the walls of the music school, heralding the dawn of a quiet revolution. The practice room was cloaked in shadows, the faint light from a solitary lamp casting long, wavering shapes across the polished wooden floor. Elara sat at the grand piano, her fingers poised above the keys, trembling slightly as if caught between two worlds. The silence around her was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, a tangible force pressing down on her chest. Her muteness was a constant companion, but here, in this institution where silence was law, it felt like both a refuge and a prison. She had learned to speak through music, to weave her emotions into melodies that transcended words. Yet even music was confined to the stage, to the moments when performance was sanctioned. Outside of that, the school demanded absolute quiet, no whispers, no murmurs, no laughter. The rule was sacred, upheld with an almost religious fervor by Headmaster Corwin and his loyal faculty. Elara's gaze drifted to the worn sheet music resting on the stand, the notes etched like a secret language only she could fully understand. She wanted to play, not just the notes, but the feelings beneath them, yet the fear of consequences kept her fingers frozen. Her chest tightened as the ache of isolation gnawed at her. A soft shuffle interrupted the stillness. Elara's eyes flicked toward the door, where Jasper stood hesitating, his tall frame outlined by the dim corridor light. He was impeccably dressed, his neat attire a stark contrast to the unspoken tension swirling between them. Jasper's eyes met hers, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them, a mixture of admiration, caution, and unspoken conflict. Jasper had always been reserved, keeping his emotions carefully guarded beneath a composed exterior. The pressures of his wealthy family and the expectations that came with it weighed heavily on him. Yet in Elara he saw something fragile and fierce, a quiet defiance that resonated with his own hidden desires for freedom. He stepped into the room, closing the doors softly behind him. No words were spoken, none could be. Instead, Jasper's gaze lingered on Elaros's hands, the poised fingers trembling with unspent emotion. Slowly, he nodded, not a command, but a gesture of understanding and support. It was a small act, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight that neither dared voice aloud. Elara's lips quivered in response, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. In that silent exchange, a fragile bridge formed between them, a tentative connection that defied the school's rigid rules and the isolation they both endured. The bell rang, signaling the end of practice. Students began to file out, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets and the unyielding silence. Jasper lingered for a moment, then turned to leave, casting one last look over his shoulder. Elara remained at the piano, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The struggle within her was no longer just about the silence. It was about trust, about reaching beyond the walls she had built around herself. Jasper's presence complicated everything, the rules, her resolve, the fragile sense of safety she had cultivated. Yet it also illuminated a path forward, faint and uncertain but undeniably real. As the corridor emptied, Elara allowed her fingers to fall onto the keys, playing a quiet, trembling melody. It was not a performance, not yet, but a whisper of rebellion, a song of yearning that spoke louder than any words ever could. Outside, the school's imposing silhouette stood against the fading light, a fortress of tradition and discipline. Inside, Invisible threads of tension wove through the halls, binding and unraveling in equal measure. Ilara's silent struggle was just beginning, but already it promised to change everything. The next day, in the common room, Jasper sat alone, his thoughts tangled as tightly as the notes Elara played the night before. He was caught between loyalty to the institution and the stirring of emotions he barely understood, watching Elara navigate her world without a voice. Yet with such fierce determination awakened something inside him, a desire to break free, to challenge the silence. He glanced at the other students, many of whom had already accepted the rule without question. Their faces were masks of discipline, but beneath the surface, Elara sensed the same restlessness she felt. It was a quiet undercurrent, waiting to be stirred. Later, during a group rehearsal, the oppressive quiet weighed on everyone. Elara sat beside Jasper at the grand piano, their fingers brushing briefly as they prepared to play a duet. The moment was electric, a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle, and perhaps the beginning of something more. Jasper caught her eye, offering a subtle nod of encouragement. Elara responded with a small, hopeful smile. In that instant, the silence felt less like a cage and more like a canvas. Fragile, yes, but with the potential to hold new melodies. As their music filled the room, the notes spoke of tension and longing, restraint and defiance. The walls of the school, so long unyielding, seemed to pulse with the possibility of change. Yet the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risks that could shatter fragile alliances and deepen wounds. Elara's silent struggles had only just begun, but with Jasper by her side, the journey promised to be as complex as it was necessary. Together, they faced the impossible, to find a voice in the silence and to break through the barriers that kept them apart. The silence is waiting, but so is the music, ready to speak. The rehearsal hall was bathed in a muted glow, the late afternoon light filtering through tall, narrow windows and casting elongated shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room carried the heavy stillness of unspoken rules, an almost sacred silence that wrapped itself around every student like an invisible shroud. Elara sat at the grand piano, her delicate fingers hovering just above the worn ivory keys, the smooth surface cool beneath her palms. Ilara's dark hair was pulled back tightly, revealing the tension etched in her observant eyes. Her breath was steady, but inside, a storm of emotions churned, frustration, yearning, and a growing resolute courage. This was not just another rehearsal. It was the moment she had been inching toward in secret, a chance to push against the invisible wall that confined her, to speak without words. The notes wove through the room like a whispered secret, their softness belying the strength of the emotions they carried. She played not just to the music, but to those who might understand the message beneath, the longing, the defiance, the hope for connection. Across the room, Mira watched intently, her freckled face alive with an unspoken encouragement. Their eyes met briefly, and Elara tilted her head just so, a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but charged with meaning. It was a silent signal of rebellion, a shared understanding that the rules could be bent, if only just a little. Professor Lyle stood at the edge of the rehearsal space, his tall frame rigid, his silver hair catching the light. His gaze was fixed on Elara, sharp and assessing. For a moment, the stern mask softened, his eyes reflecting a flicker of sympathy and conflict. He had always been the enforcer of the silence rule, yet here was a student daring to challenge it in the quietest way imaginable. The old rigidity in him wavered, though duty still held firm. Jasper, seated nearby with his sheet music neatly arranged, glanced at Elara with a guarded expression. His tall frame was tense, hands folded tightly in his lap, as if restraining himself. There was admiration in his eyes, yes, but also fear. Fear of the consequences that might follow if the fragile order was disturbed. Yet beneath that fear lay a yearning, not unlike Elara's, a desire to break free from the suffocating expectations that bound them all. The music swelled and softened, winding through the room like a breath held too long. Elara's hands moved with growing confidence, each note a thread weaving a tapestry of feeling that words could never capture. The silence that usually defined the space was no longer an absence but a canvas, filled with the delicate, defiant strokes of her artistry. As the final chord lingered, the room remained still, not out of obedience, but in the suspended moment of realization. Something had shifted. The unspoken had been spoken, if only through a glance and a melody. The conductor lowered his baton, and the students exchanged fleeting looks, their expressions a mix of surprise, curiosity, and quiet solidarity. Myra's lips curved into a small, triumphant smile, while Jasper's eyes searched Elara's face, silently offering his support. Professor Lyle cleared his throat, breaking the spell. His voice was low but firm as he addressed the room. Remember the rules. Silence outside performance is not just tradition, it is discipline. But even as the words echoed, they felt less like a command and more like a question, a challenge hanging in the air. Elara gathered her sheet music, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with obstacles, but, for the first time, the silence that had once imprisoned her felt permeable, vulnerable to the quiet defiance she now embodied. As the students filed out, whispers of the rehearsal's unusual tension stirred beneath the surface. Sophie's sharp eyes and sharper tongue would surely fan these sparks into rumors, but Elara felt ready. The first crack in the school's austere silence had been made, a crack that might one day become a doorway. In the fading light, Elara exchanged one last look with Myra, a promise passing between them, a promise of rebellion, of connection, and of hope. And in that charged moment, the silent halls seemed just a little less empty. The corridors hummed with a silence heavier than usual, but beneath it, whispers slid like shadows quiet, elusive yet impossible to ignore. Sophie's voice was low, carrying just enough to be heard by those close, her smirk sharp as she leaned into the cluster of students gathered near the stairwell. "Did you see? Elara was mouthing something during rehearsal yesterday," she murmured, eyes gleaming with mischief and something colder beneath. The silence rule forbade speech outside performances, but whispers like these were the exception, dangerous, secretive, yet pervasive. Sophie had become the unofficial conduit of such rumors, her gossip weaving a subtle web that began to isolate Elara more with each passing day. Elara sat alone in the practice room, the worn keys of the piano cool beneath her fingertips. She pressed a chord softly, the sound filling the small space with fragile warmth. Yet even the music seemed swallowed by the heavy quiet that pressed against the walls. Through the locked door, muffled murmurs drifted, snippets of Sophie's whispers, like distant thunder rolling in a silent storm. Her eyes, dark and observant, traced the patterns of light and shadow cast by the afternoon sun slipping through the tall windows. Every note she played was a plea, a breath of defiance against the unyielding silence that the school demanded. But the rumors gnawed at her resolve, threatening to reduce her to nothing more than a ghost among peers, who now looked at her with suspicion, veiled thinly behind polite nods. Outside, the courtyard was alive with the muted rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city beyond the school's gates. Mira's footsteps were purposeful as she sought out Sophie, her short, curly hair catching the light, freckles standing out like constellations against her pale skin. "Enough," Mira said quietly, voice steady but fierce. "You don't get to decide what people say about Elara, or anyone." Her gaze was unwavering, the defiance in her stance a silent rebellion against the suffocating rules and the cruelty of gossip. Sophie's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of uncertainty, but she quickly masked it with a dismissive shrug. "I'm just telling what I hear," she replied, though the sharp edge in her tone betrayed the tension simmering beneath. Meanwhile, in the bustling cafeteria, Theo caught sight of Elara slipping in quietly to a corner table. His broad shoulders relaxed as he offered a small, encouraging smile. Though words were forbidden, his expression spoke volumes, an unspoken promise that she was not alone. Elara returned the smile with a slight nod, a flicker of gratitude warming her chest. Theo's quiet support was a balm to her frayed nerves, a reminder that even in the thickest silence, connections could still be forged. But the shadow of Sophie's rumors lingered, casting long, uneasy shadows over the school. Students glanced at Elara with a mixture of curiosity and caution, whispers threading through the halls like a slow-growing storm. The tension was palpable, an electric charge beneath the rigid order. In the practice rooms, the music took on a sharper edge notes, played with more urgency, fingers striking keys with a tension that mirrored the unrest growing among the students. The silence rule, once simply a discipline, now felt like a cage tightening around their throats. Elara's muteness, once a solitary burden, now seemed entwined with the enforced silence of the school, both conspiring to isolate her further. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet resistance was stirring. Myra's defiant stance against Sophie's gossip, Theo's subtle gestures of friendship, they were small acts, but together they kindled a fragile hope. As the day waned and shadows lengthened, Elara closed her eyes and let her fingers drift over the keys in a slow, haunting melody. It was a song without words, yet it spoke volumes of loneliness, of courage, of the yearning to be heard beyond the silence. Outside, the whispers continued, but within the walls of the school, a new sound was taking shape, a chorus, not of voices, but of hearts daring to break the silence. The chapter closed with Elara's music lingering in the air, a soft defiance echoing in the stillness, hinting at the coming storm. Sophie's rumors, passed from lip to ear, began to shift the social currents of the school. Some students avoided Elara outright, their eyes averted as if the mere act of looking might violate the silence rule. Others whispered in hushed tones, their curiosity mingling with fear. Myra's protective vigilance never wavered. She shadowed Elara's steps, offering small smiles and occasional notes of encouragement scrawled on scraps of paper. Their bond, forged in silent understanding, became a quiet rebellion against the oppressive atmosphere. Jasper, too, watched from a distance, his reserved demeanor masking a conflicted heart. He admired Elara's courage, but feared the consequences of open defiance. His own struggle mirrored the tensions gripping the schooler, desire to conform, clashing with the impulse to break free. Professor Lyle tread the line between enforcement and empathy. His stern gaze often softened when it fell on Elara, a silent acknowledgement of the cost borne by those bound by the silence rule. Yet his role demanded discipline, and the pressure to uphold tradition weighed heavily upon him. The whispers grew louder, not in sound but in effect. Elara felt the walls closing in, the silence no longer a shield but a barrier that isolated her in a crowd. Yet within her, the music swelled an unspoken language more powerful than words, carrying the weight of her defiance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elara found herself alone in the grand hall. The polished floor gleamed beneath the fading light, and the empty seats seemed to hold their breath. She sat at the piano, fingers poised, and began to play. The melody was soft at first, tentative, a whisper against the encroaching silence. But it grew, rising with a fierce beauty that filled the space and reached into the hearts of those who heard it. It was a song of sorrow and hope, of isolation and connection, breaking through the walls that words could not tear down. Outside the hall, footsteps paused. Students and faculty alike found themselves drawn to the music, their fears and doubts momentarily suspended. In that moment, the silence rule felt less like a chain and more like a canvas, waiting to be filled with the colors of courage and change. Elara's fingers danced across the keys, weaving a tapestry of sound that spoke louder than any whispered rumor. The whispers would not silence her, not now, not ever. As the last note lingered in the air, fading into the quiet, Elara opened her eyes. The room was empty, but the echo of her music remained a promise of defiance, a song of solidarity. And somewhere in the shadows, Sophie's smirk faltered once more, the seeds of doubt planted in the fertile ground of change. The silent halls were beginning to stir. The soft tapping of fingers on the cajon echoed faintly through the small rehearsal room, a gentle counterpoint to the stillness that otherwise dominated the halls of the prestigious music school. Elara sat at the grand piano, her fingers hovering hesitantly above the keys. The oppressive silence that enveloped the building weighed heavily on her chest, a constant reminder of the strict edict forbidding any spoken word beyond the concert hall. Theo's eyes sparkled with quiet encouragement as he tapped a soft rhythm, careful not to break the school's silence rule, but offering a subtle beat that invited Elara into the flow of music. She inhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as she pressed down the first notes. The melody unfurled hesitantly at first, then, with growing confidence, each chord a whispered defiance against the suffocating quiet. "You've got this," Theo's eyes seemed to say, his smile a silent benediction. Elara caught the unspoken message and let the music carry her further, her fingers dancing across the keys with a newfound grace. The oppressive rules still loomed, but in this shared space, a fragile bond formed, one that did not require words. Later that day, as the corridors buzzed with the muffled footsteps of students scurrying between classes, Elara felt the familiar sting of isolation. The walls seemed to close in, each glance a reminder of her muteness and the school's rigid discipline. But then, in the midst of a routine silence patrol, Theo was there, again, his eyes locking with hers across the crowded hallway. He gave a subtle thumbs up, a gesture so small yet so laden with meaning it felt like a whispered rebellion. Elara's lips curved into a faint smile, a spark of connection in the vast sea of silence. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that even within the confines of this austere institution, human warmth could blossom quietly. As evening settled, the soft amber light filtered through the tall windows of the music school's common room. Theo pulled out a scrap of paper and a pencil, sketching a quick caricature of Elara, her delicate features, the dark hair always tied back, and her observant eyes. When he showed it to her, her laughter, rare sound in this place, was silent but genuine. The caricature was imperfect, playful, and full of life, a stark contrast to the rigid silence that usually defined their world. Their friendship, built on gestures and shared silences, became a sanctuary. In fleeting moments like these, the heavy emotional barriers that separated them seemed to crack just a little, allowing warmth and hope to seep through. Yet, as Elara walked away to continue her practice, the weight of the school's rules pressed down once more. The lingering glance she exchanged with Theo was a silent promise, they would face the silence together. It was a small act of courage, a delicate chord struck in the vast composition of oppression that surrounded them. This chapter of their lives was not without risk. Theo's light-heartedness was a shield, a way to ease the tension that built with every passing day. But beneath the laughter was a shared understanding that the silence rule was more than just a regulation. It was a barrier to connection, to freedom, to the full expression of their art and their souls. In the quiet moments between rehearsals, in the subtle rhythms of their friendship, Elara found a spark of courage. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but she was no longer alone. Theo's support was a testament to the possibility of solidarity, of small rebellions that could ripple outward and perhaps, one day, transform the very meaning of silence at the school. As she returned to the piano, the notes seemed to sing with a newfound clarity. Each key was a voice, each chord a statement of resilience. Elara's music was no longer just a refuge, it was a language of defiance and hope. And as the first notes of her playing filled the room, a quiet revolution began to take shape, one beat, one gesture, one silent promise at a time. The oppressive silence that had once seemed absolute was now pierced by the faint but resolute chords of friendship and courage. Elara felt it deep within her, a fragile but powerful harmony that could not be silenced. The question lingered in the air as the music faded. How long before this quiet support would swell into something unstoppable? The answer would be found in the notes yet to be played, in the silences yet to be broken. And in that waiting, Elara sat poised, ready to strike the keys once more. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken accusations, the atmosphere taut as the strings of a violin ready to snap. Professor Lyle stood rigid, his arms folded, eyes hard beneath furrowed brows. Two other faculty members flanked him, their faces unreadable beneath the soft illumination of the sheet music lamps. Myra's freckles seemed to deepen in the dim light, her short curls framing a face that bore no trace of fear, only a quiet defiance. She remained silent, a posture that was both her shield and her statement. The silence rule was absolute, but her subtle acts of rebellion had not gone unnoticed. Small gestures, a lingering glance, a note passed in secret, yet even these were enough to draw the faculty's ire. Elara stood at the back of the room, her observant eyes fixed on Myra, though mute. Elara's internal world was loud with empathy and an aching solidarity. Her heart beat unevenly, a rhythm of anxiety and pride swelling within her. This confrontation was more than a reprimand. It was a fracture in the school's polished faculty. The faculty's voices were lowered, but the weight of their words pressed down like a heavy fog. Mira's refusal to apologize or shrink under their gaze unsettled them. She was not just a student, she was becoming a symbol, a quiet storm challenging the institution's strict hold. Outside, the school's corridors and courtyards were alive with whispers, the students' voices barely above breath. Huddled in clusters, they exchanged furtive glances toward the faculty wing, where Myra was held. The enforced silence seemed to crack beneath the pressure of their shared unease. Even Theo, the class clown with his easy smile, felt the gravity of the moment, his usual levity replaced by a solemn determination. As twilight draped the school grounds in a cool blue, Mira found refuge in the secluded courtyard with Elara and Theo. A single lantern cast flickering shadows across their faces, illuminating the hope that glimmered despite the oppression. Mira's eyes shone with a fierce light as she shared whispered plans for subtle resistance. Small acts that could be woven into the fabric of the school's daily life, challenging the silence rule without outright rebellion. Elara listened, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air, her mind composing the unspoken melodies of their quiet revolt. Theo, usually the jester, nodded with unexpected seriousness, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling uncertainty. The night deepened, but a fragile harmony had formed between them, a pact of courage and creative tension that promised to unravel the strictures binding them. The school's silence, once an impenetrable fortress, now showed signs of fracture beneath the surface. As they parted, Elara's eyes met Myra's in a moment of unspoken understanding. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with risk, but the seeds of change had been sown. In the midst of silence, their voices had begun to rise, subtle but undeniable. And somewhere deep within the ancient walls of the music school, the chords of that silent revolution began to echo. This chapter captures the mounting tension as Myra's quiet defiance draws the scrutiny and reprimand of the faculty. Particularly Professor Lyle, whose conflicted loyalty adds complexity to the power dynamics. Elara's internal world is vividly portrayed, emphasizing her emotional support despite her muteness. The students' whispered conversations and growing unease highlight the cracks forming in the institution's rigid silence, setting the stage for the burgeoning resistance. The chapter closes on a hopeful note as Myra, Elara, and Theo unite in a shared resolve, marking a pivotal moment in their collective journey toward breaking the silence. The narrative style blends introspective depth with subtle interpersonal dynamics, reflecting the influences of Kazuo Ishiguro and Sally Rooney, weaving emotional restraint with underlying creative tension. Sensory details evoke the oppressive yet fragile atmosphere, while naturalistic dialogue and internal reflections build a compelling portrayal of courage amidst repression. Elara's fingers hovered just above the ivory keys, trembling slightly, while Jasper's gaze flickered between her hands and the dim glow of the lamp overhead. They had always been careful to students bound by silence, yet carrying heavy internal stories unable to be spoken aloud. Tonight, however, felt different. There was a fragile tension in the air that stretched between them, a silent promise hanging softly, like a whispered melody waiting to be played. Elara shifted her seat closer to the piano bench's edge, her dark eyes fixed on the keys before her. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance that had long separated her from others, but words were impossible. Instead, she let her fingers press a tentative chord, a gentle ripple of sound that filled the small room with warmth. Jasper's hand followed, responding with a harmony that felt like an answer to a question she hadn't asked aloud. Their music spoke in a language older than words, a conversation of sighs, hopes, and fears. Jasper's usually guarded demeanor softened as he met Elara's gaze. He was tall and neatly dressed, the discipline of his background etched into every careful movement. Yet here, in this moment, the walls he'd built around himself seemed to tremble. His breath caught as he realized the courage it took for Elara to share even this small fragment of herself. She was mute by nature and constrained by the school's silence rule. But through these shared notes, she was daring to express what words could never capture. The room seemed to shrink around them, the rest of the world fading into obscurity. Elara's heart pounded quietly beneath her ribs, a rhythm matched by the subtle pulse of Jasper's own restrained emotions. For a fleeting second, the oppressive silence that governed their lives was replaced by a vibrant, living soundscape woven between their fingers. Later, as the corridors emptied and the distant echo of footsteps faded into the night, Elara walked alone beneath the high arches of the school's hallways. The stone walls, cool and unforgiving, enclosed her in the solitude she had grown accustomed to. But tonight, she felt a new presence. Jasper's footsteps, careful and measured, followed her at a respectful distance. Neither spoke. The silence between them was charged with unspoken understanding. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange filled with tentative hope and the recognition of shared loneliness. They found themselves in the garden courtyard, a secret refuge where the night air was crisp and alive with the scent of blooming jasmine. Elara pulled a small, folded note from her pocket, a habit she'd developed to give voice to the words trapped inside her. With a nervous glance, she extended it toward Jasper. His fingers closed around the delicate paper, and as he read, a guarded expression softened into something almost like a smile. The note was simple, yet profound. "Thank you for seeing me." Jasper looked up, his eyes reflecting the glow of distant stars. For a moment, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve, revealing the fragile hope that had blossomed in the silence. They lingered there, two souls reaching out without words, finding solace in the quiet promise of connection. Back in the practice room, their final scene together unfolded like a delicate duet. Elara struck the opening notes, her touch light and expressive, her music a narrative of longing and courage. Jasper joined in, weaving his melody alongside hers, their harmonies entwining in a tender dance. Each chord was a question, each pause a breath held in anticipation. The music spoke of vulnerability, of the walls they'd built to protect themselves, now cracking under the weight of shared emotion. As the last note lingered in the air, the spell of their silent conversation remained unbroken. They sat in the glow of the lamp, hearts echoing the rhythms they had created. In this moment, Elara was not defined by her muteness, nor the school's oppressive rules. She was a voice, a presence, salient, hopeful, and beautifully alive. But as the final echoes faded, the question lingered in the quiet between them. How long could this fragile intimacy survive in a world that demanded silence? The tension of their unspoken feelings remained unresolved, yet undeniable, promising that the path ahead would be both difficult and transformative. With a shared glance, they rose from the piano bench, Elara's delicate hand brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear, Jasper's breath steady but heavy with unvoiced emotion. Neither spoke as they parted, but in their eyes was a silent promise to carry this connection forward, no matter the cost. The night swallowed their footsteps as they disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a lingering melody of hope and quiet defiance. The halls remained silent, but something had shifted beneath the surface, a subtle chord struck that might one day resonate beyond the walls of the school itself. And for Elara, that fragile harmony was enough to keep her moving forward. The walls, lined with framed photographs of past musical luminaries and faded concert programs, bore witness to decades of discipline and tradition. Tonight, however, the room felt heavy with an unspoken tension. Lyle sat behind his worn mahogany desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin as his eyes lingered on a music score left carelessly in a student's folder. The faint scent of old paper and polish mingled with the lingering echo of piano notes from the practice rooms below. His gaze shifted to the window, where the moon cast a pale silver glow over the campus, illuminating the silhouette of the grand concert hall, a place sacred to the school's ethos. His thoughts were restless, circling around Elara, the mute pianist whose silent struggle had quietly unsettled the school's rigid order. He recalled the first time he had truly watched her play, the way her fingers whispered secrets across the keyboard, weaving melodies that spoke louder than any forbidden words. There was a raw honesty in her music, a defiance wrapped in delicate restraint. Lyle's role as an enforcer of the silence rule had always been clear-cut. The school's reputation hinged on the discipline it demanded. No speaking outside performance, no distractions, only pure music. Yet Elara's case was different. Her silence was not a choice, but a condition, and her music was not merely performance, but a lifeline. The conflict within Lyle gnawed at him. He sympathized with her isolation, felt the weight of her emotional barriers, and recognized the courage in her subtle acts of defiance. Yet, every time he considered bending the rules, the stern image of Headmaster Corwin loomed large in his mind, the embodiment of tradition and unyielding order. During the faculty meeting earlier that day, Corwin had been as resolute as ever. His voice, firm and unrelenting, had echoed through the austere room. "The silence rule is the foundation of our discipline," he declared. "It is essential for artistic purity and focus. We must not allow exceptions." Lyle had nodded along with the others, his expression neutral, but inside a storm raged. He thought of Elara's quiet resilience, of Myra's whispered rebellions, and of the growing unrest among the students. The school's silence was no longer a shield but a cage. After the meeting, Lyle lingered by the practice rooms, watching as Elara sat alone at the grand piano, her dark hair tied back, fingers moving with a fluid grace that belied her silence. Her eyes, deep and observant, seemed to search for something beyond the notes, a connection, an understanding. Moved by an impulse he barely recognized, Lyle approached her quietly, careful not to startle. Without a word, he placed a folded note inside her music folder before slipping away into the shadows. The note bore a simple message: "Your music speaks what words cannot. You are not alone." This small act of rebellion was a fragile hope, a silent alliance forged in secrecy. It marked a turning point not only for Elara, but for Lyle himself, hinting at a deeper struggle between duty and compassion. As the days passed, Lyle found himself increasingly torn between his role as an enforcer and his desire to nurture the spark of change Elara represented. He began to question the very foundations of the silence rule and the emotional cost it exacted from the students. In quiet moments, he would revisit that note, wondering if it might inspire Elara to push further, to break the barriers that bound her and the school. Yet, he also feared the consequences, for her, for himself, and for the fragile order they all inhabited. The chapter closed on Lyle standing once more by the window, the moonlight bathing the campus in a soft glow. Somewhere beyond the silent halls, music played, not just notes on a page, but the unspoken chords of courage, connection, and change. And in that silent night, a quiet revolution seemed to hum beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to break free. The tension in the school was palpable. Each day, Elara felt it more keenly, the watchful eyes, the whispered judgments, the invisible walls closing in tighter. Yet, amidst this, Professor Lyle's subtle gestures of support became a source of unexpected strength. During their lessons, he maintained the formal distance required by his position, but his eyes often lingered on her with a softness that spoke volumes. When Elara faltered, he offered a reassuring nod. When she played with fierce emotion, he allowed a rare, approving smile. Their relationship was a complex dance, a balance of authority and empathy, silence and unspoken understanding. Lyle's conflicted loyalty mirrored the larger struggle within the institution, embodying the tension between preservation and change. In a rare moment after class, Lyle caught Elara's gaze and motioned toward her folder. She nodded, understanding the unspoken message, and found the note he had slipped inside earlier. It was a lifeline, a quiet rebellion wrapped in ink and paper, but the risk was ever present. Sophie's rumors grew louder, and the faculty's patience wore thin. Corwin's presence loomed like a shadow, his belief in discipline unshaken even as doubt flickered briefly in his eyes when he observed Elara's growing influence. As the chapter unfolded, the reader is drawn into the intricate web of loyalties and betrayals, hopes and fears. It is a chapter of subtle power plays and fragile connections, where every glance and gesture carries weight. The question remains, in a world where silence is law, can a single voice, even one without words, change everything? The closing scene finds Lyle alone once more, pen in hand, writing a letter he may never send. His thoughts are a tangle of conviction and hesitation, the embodiment of the chapter's central conflict. Outside, the faint strains of Elara's piano echo through the silent halls, a melody of defiance and hope that refuses to be silenced. And in that echo, the promise of transformation lingers, fragile yet undeniable. The once impenetrable silence that cloaked the hallways began to crack, imperceptibly at first, like the faintest vibration beneath a still surface. In a modest music room tucked away near the back of the school, Mira sat at the head of a small, tightly knit group of students. The flickering light from a single desk lamp cast warm shadows across their faces, illuminating a shared resolve that had been too long dormant. Scattered across the table lay scraps of paper filled with hastily scribbled notes and musical annotations, silent manifestos of dissent. Myra's voice, though barely above a whisper, carried the weight of conviction as she spoke. "We can't keep living like this," she said, her eyes scanning the circle, the silence outside the stage suffocating. "It kills the music before it even starts." Elara listened intently, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the table. Though she could not speak, the language between her and Mira was fluent and profound, conveyed through subtle nods and the shared cadence of their breathing. The idea of breaking free from the oppressive silence ignited a spark within her, a hope she had long buried beneath layers of restraint. The gathering dispersed silently, each student returning to their routines with a secret fire kindling in their hearts. Words spread in whispers and coded glances, the collective yearning swelling beneath the surface of enforced quietude. Meanwhile, in a secluded corner of the school's practice rooms, Elara sat at an old upright piano, the chipped keys worn from years of use. She closed her eyes and let her fingers dance across the ivories, pouring into the music the emotions she could not voice. The melody was unsettled, sometimes trembling, sometimes fierce, a mirror of the turmoil within her. For a moment, doubt flickered across his stern expression, an echo of the youthful idealism he once held. But his resolve hardened swiftly. The silence rule was the bedrock of the institution's integrity, and he would defend it at all costs. In the corridors, amidst the tension, Theo offered a rare glimmer of light-heartedness. As her music filled the room, a few students paused in the hallway, drawn by the unusual intensity of her playing. Their faces softened, shadows of empathy and courage flickering in their eyes. Yet, not all within the school walls welcomed this stirring unrest. In his austere office, Headmaster Corwin stood rigid, the afternoon light casting long, somber shadows. His piercing eyes scanned a report detailing the subtle acts of defiance spreading among the students. His mischievous grin and easy jokes broke through the oppressive atmosphere, coaxing nervous students toward secret rehearsals where music and whispered plans intertwined. His laughter, though quiet, was a bomb, weaving fragile bonds of solidarity. As the day waned, the air in the school thickened with anticipation. The gathering storm of quiet rebellion was gathering strength, its first gusts stirring the stillness, promising change. For Elara and her peers, the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with risk. But the shared pulse of defiance and hope beat steadily beneath the silence. And so, As night fell and the school settled once more into its enforced quiet, the music of resistance whispered softly a promise that the silence would not hold forever. The coming days would test the limits of courage and conviction, and the fragile harmony of tradition and change would be pushed to its breaking point. But in that tension lay the possibility of transformation. Elara's fingers hovered over the keys once more, poised to play the first notes of a new, unspoken song. Elara sat alone in the dim practice room, her fingers resting lightly on the worn keys of the grand piano, the only place where her silence could find voice. The room smelled faintly of old wood and polish, the scent of years of dedication and suppressed expression. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, strands falling round her delicate face, as her observant eyes traced the contours of the keys, imagining melodies that had yet to find their way into the world. A hesitant knock at the door broke the quiet. Elara's gaze lifted sharply, pulse quickening with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. The door creaked open to reveal Jasper, his tall figure outlined against the muted light of the hallway. His neatly pressed jacket seemed almost out of place in the stillness, and his guarded expression softened as he stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him. "Elara," he whispered, voice low and careful, as if the very walls might betray him. I wanted to say, I'm with you. I know it's dangerous, but you're not alone." Elara's eyes glistened, the faintest curve of a smile breaking through her usual reserve. She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing against the piano keys in a silent gesture of thanks. The room seemed to breathe with a new energy, fragile yet undeniable. Outside, the grand hall was alive with the rigid formality of a school assembly. Headmaster Corwin stood at the front, his tall, austere figure commanding attention. Silver hair gleamed under the chandelier's light, his piercing eyes sweeping over the gathered students with an intensity that brooked no dissent. "Remember," he intoned, voice firm and unwavering, "our silence outside performance is not mere tradition. It is the foundation of our artistic purity. Words distract, emotions cloud the mind. Discipline requires silence." A hush fell over the room, but beneath the surface, a current of unrest stirred. Students exchanged glances, the weight of the edict pressing against growing undercurrents of rebellion. Later, in the cool hush of the courtyard, Elara and Jasper found themselves alone amidst the scattered leaves, the chill of the evening wrapping round them. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was different now, charged with the promise of something unspoken yet deeply felt. A soft breeze stirred the fallen leaves, rustling gently like the tentative threads weaving their connection. Jasper's hand brushed briefly against Elara's as they moved to sit on the stone bench, a gesture small but monumental in its implication. Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, the barriers of silence and fear seemed to waver. Suddenly, the door to the practice room burst open. Mira stood framed in the doorway, her short, curly hair catching the light, freckles dusting her expressive face like constellations. Her eyes blazed with fierce determination. "Elara," she said, voice low but urgent, "we can't wait any longer. This silence suffocates us. You're the spark, and it's time to let the fire burn." Elara looked from Mira to Jasper, the creative tension between the three friends palpable. Myra's rebellious energy collided with Elara's quiet resolve and Jasper's cautious loyalty, forging a fragile but powerful alliance. "Are you ready to break the surface?" Mira challenged, stepping fully into the room, her gaze unwavering. Elara's fingers hovered over the piano keys, the notes of resistance and hope vibrating beneath her skin. The choice was hers, and the cost would be great. Yet, for the first time, the silence felt less like a cage and more like a canvas. As the chapter closed, the stage was set not just for Elara's personal defiance, but for the quiet revolution simmering beneath the school's polished exterior. The fragile bonds of trust and rebellion intertwined, hinting at the transformative power of courage born from silence. What would happen when the carefully constructed walls of tradition finally gave way to the music of change? The answer lingered in the air, poised on the edge of the next note. Yet inside this space, a new language was blossoming. Elara sat at the worn piano, the polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the evening light filtering through tall windows. Her fingers hovered just above the keys before descending in a delicate cascade of notes. Each sound was precise, a carefully crafted syllable in the unspoken dialogue she was weaving. Myra sat nearby, her freckled face illuminated by the soft light, her eyes locked on Elara with an intensity that betrayed her quiet rebellion. She understood the coded messages embedded in the music, the subtle crescendos that spoke of yearning, the gentle diminuendos that whispered of hesitation. It was as if Elara's piano had become a voice, one that could circumvent the oppressive silence that blanketed the school halls. The room was a sanctuary where the rigidity of the institution faded, replaced by the fluidity of emotion that music allowed. Mira's fingers tapped rhythmically on her knee, mirroring the pulse of the notes, their shared understanding deepening without a single word exchanged. Elara's gaze lifted briefly, catching Mira's encouraging smile, and a flicker of hope stirred within her. Later, during a group rehearsal in the grand hall, the air was taut with the anticipation of perfection. The students sat poised, instruments in hand, faces masked by the school's unspoken edict of silence. Elara's turn arrived, and as her fingers began their familiar dance across the keys, she introduced a new elementa series of subtle hand gestures timed with the music's ebb and flow. These gestures were not merely accompaniment, but a deliberate extension of her expression, a silent conversation unfolding in tandem with the melody. Jasper, seated nearby, caught the gesturous slight tilt of her wrist. A graceful arc of her fingers and his guarded eyes softened momentarily. Beneath his composed exterior, he felt a tremor of connection, an acknowledgement of the courage it took to defy the silence in such a nuanced way. The music wove around them, binding their unspoken feelings in a fragile tapestry of mutual respect and tentative intimacy. Professor Lyle stood at the back of the hall, his arms crossed, his sharp eyes flicking between the performers. His expression was a study in conflict, his duty to uphold the silence, rule battling with the empathy he harbored for Elara. He saw in her performance not just defiance, but a profound need to be understood, to communicate beyond the limitations imposed by the institution. A small, almost imperceptible nod from him suggested a crack in his otherwise stern facade. After the rehearsal, the courtyard offered a rare respite from the school's oppressive atmosphere. The early evening sun cast long shadows, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the ancient trees lining the path. Theo, ever the class clown, broke the silence with a playful jab at Jasper's overly serious demeanor, eliciting a reluctant chuckle. Laughter, so rare in these halls, rippled through the group, and Elara found herself drawn into the moment. Her smile was hesitant at first, but as the warmth of camaraderie spread, it blossomed into something genuiner, fragile, but vital connection. The day's events marked a subtle turning point. Elara's innovative use of music and gestures was more than personal expression. It was a quiet challenge to the school's doctrine. Her peers began to see her not just as the mute pianist bound by silence, but as a catalyst for change. Bonds formed in the shared language of music and motion, weaving a network of understanding that defied the imposed barriers. Yet beneath the hope, tension lingered. The school's traditions were formidable, and the consequences of defiance were real. Elara knew that every silent conversation carried risk. But for the first time, the possibility of transformation stirred in the air a promise that the walls of silence might one day give way to a richer, more nuanced harmony. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the courtyard in the soft glow of twilight, Elara lingered a moment longer, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. In the silence between notes, she found a voice, one that no rule could silence. And somewhere deep within, a quiet revolution began. Headmaster Corwin sat rigidly behind his desk, his silver hair catching the rare light, making him seem almost spectral in the stillness. Before him lay a stack of reports, whispers of disobedience, subtle breaches of the sacred silence rule. His piercing eyes scanned each word, the weight of his responsibility pressing heavily on his broad shoulders. For decades, Corwin had nurtured the belief that silence outside of performance was the crucible in which true artistry was forged. Discipline, focus, emotional restraint, these were the pillars that upheld the school's revered reputation. Yet, as he reviewed the accounts of Elara's subtle gestures and Mira's quiet defiance, a flicker of unease stirred within him. Was the silence he so fervently championed beginning to fracture beneath the pressure of human yearning? Meanwhile, elsewhere in the sprawling campus, Elara sat at the edge of the practice room, her dark hair pulled back tightly, fingers resting lightly on the keys of a grand piano. Across the room, Mira tuned her violin, the soft scrape of strings punctuating the heavy quiet. Their eyes met, a silent conversation unfolding in the space between them. Words unnecessary, replaced instead by shared understanding and a burgeoning hope. In this muted world, every glance, every breath held meaning. Professor Lyle, the ever-watchful music instructor, paced the adjacent corridor. His gaze lingered momentarily on the practice room window, where Elara and Myra's quiet communion played out like a secret melody. Though he was bound by duty to enforce the silence rule, his heart throbbed with conflicting emotions. He admired Elara's resilience and the courage it took to challenge norms, yet feared the consequences that such defiance might bring upon them all. In the hushed grand hall, Jasper stood alone, his tall frame casting a solitary shadow on the marble floor. His fingers traced absent patterns on the polished surface of the grand piano, each touch trembling with restrained emotion. He wrestled internally, caught between the weight of familial expectations and the stirring admiration he held for Elara's bravery. The chasm between conformity and change yawned wide before him, and he was uncertain which path to take. As the day progressed, Headmaster Corwin convened a meeting with the faculty. His voice, steady but carrying an undercurrent of strain, reiterated the importance of the silence rule. Yet, beneath his stern exterior, the seeds of doubt had taken root. He questioned the cost of his unyielding stance in moments of quiet solitude, wondering if the very discipline he sought to preserve was suffocating the soul of the school. The tension in the halls was palpable. Students whispered cautiously in the shadows, eyes flickering with the embers of rebellion. Elara's subtle defiance had become a spark, igniting a creative tension that threatened to dismantle the fortress of silence. And as the headmaster grappled with his convictions, the school stood at a precipice between the comfort of tradition and the promise of change. The chapter closed with Corwin alone once more, staring out at the silent courtyard, the wind stirring leaves in a quiet symphony. For the first time, his resolve wavered. Could silence truly be the only language of music? Or was there a deeper melody waiting to be heard beyond the edges of his control? The question lingered unanswered, hanging in the fragile air like a note suspended in time, prelude to the inevitable reckoning to come. But tonight, the silence carried a sharp edge, a tension that prickled at the skin like static electricity. Sophie, the ever-watchful flutist with her quick smile and quicker tongue, prowled the hallways with a new purpose. Her eyes glittered with a sly kind of delight as she gathered a small cluster of students around her, leaning in close enough that her voice was only a breath above a whisper. "Did you hear about Elara?" she murmured, her tone dripping with insinuation. "They say she's been breaking the silence rule, not just little gestures, but something much bolder. The faculty are furious, of course." Her words were like sparks, igniting curiosity and suspicion. Some students exchanged glances, their expressions flickering with a mix of fear and intrigue. Sophie's rumors spread like wildfire, each whisper carving deeper into the fabric of the school's rigid order. Meanwhile, in a secluded practice room bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, Elara sat at the grand piano. Her fingers moved over the keys with a fluid grace that spoke volumes in the absence of words. The music was her refuge, the language she had mastered since birth, and tonight it carried an undercurrent of melancholy and quiet defiance. Outside, the murmur of whispered gossip seeped through the walls, but inside, the melody wove a sanctuary of sound and feeling. Elara's dark hair was pulled back tightly, her observant eyes reflecting the flickering shadows cast by the candlelight. She felt the chill of isolation more acutely than ever, the cold weight of rumors pressing against her like an invisible wall. Yet beneath that chill was a flicker of something new, a fragile ember of hope that stirred whenever Myra's name crossed her mind. In the courtyard, Myra paced with restless energy, her freckled face set in a mask of determination. She had overheard Sophie's malicious whispers and felt a surge of protective fury rise within her. Without hesitation, she sought out Sophie, finding her surrounded by a small audience of intrigued students. "Enough," Myra said sharply, stepping into the circle with a glare that silenced the chatter. "Spreading lies about Elara won't make you any more important. She's braver than any of us for standing up in this place." Sophie's smile faltered, but she masked it quickly with a sardonic laugh. "Bravery or foolishness? You tell me. Rules exist for a reason, Mira. Don't pretend you're above them." Mira's eyes blazed. Maybe it's time the rules changed. Maybe it's time we all found our voices, even if they're silent ones. The crowd shifted uneasily, the tension thickening like a gathering storm. Elsewhere, Theo watched the confrontation with a quiet smile. His role as the class clown often made him seem aloof, but beneath that easygoing facade was a steadfast loyalty to those he cared about. After rehearsal, he found Elara alone by the piano once more. Approaching cautiously, he offered a small nod and a warm, reassuring smile. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke of solidarity and unspoken understanding. Elara returned the nod, a faint smile touching her lips. In that moment, the oppressive silence felt a little less suffocating, the fraying threads of isolation beginning to weave into a fragile tapestry of support. Yet, not all eyes looked kindly upon these developments. Headmaster Corwin, with his silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights of his office, stood rigid in his conviction. To him, silence was sacred, a vessel for artistic purity and discipline. He had built his life on order and control, and the rising dissent threatened to unravel the very fabric of the institution he had sworn to protect. He paced slowly, fingers steepled beneath his chin, wrestling with a knot of unease. The rumors, the subtle acts of rebellion, the fractures beneath the surface all were symptoms of a deeper unrest he was not prepared to acknowledge. As night deepened, the school seemed to hold its breath. The rumors whispered through the halls, friendships tested, alliances forged in silence and shadow. Elara sat at the piano, the notes ringing out clear and unyielding, a voice that refused to be silenced. The fraying threads of the school's strict order were unraveling, and no one could say yet what pattern they would weave in the end. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, stirred only by the faintest breath of wind that slipped beneath the heavy curtains. Elara sat alone at the grand piano, her delicate fingers hovering just above the keys, tracing invisible patterns in the stillness. She did not play, she could not speak, but in those silent gestures, a quiet storm brewed within her. Her eyes, deep and observant, were fixed somewhere beyond the polished surface of the keys, not on the notes, but on the invisible walls that enclosed her world. The school's rule was absolute. Silence outside the concert hall was not merely encouraged, it was demanded. No words, no whispers, no spoken thoughts. Like a sacred vow etched into every brick and echoed through every corridor. Elara's muteness, a condition she had known all her life, now felt like both a curse and a mirror. The silence imposed upon her peers was an echo of her own internal quiet. Yet it was a different kind of silence, one chosen by others, one wielded as control. She had never asked for the world to be so still, so voiceless around her, and yet here she was, caught between two silences that spoke volumes. Her breath was steady, though her chest tightened with the weight of unspoken words. She traced a finger along the edge of the keyboard, a faint tremor betraying the storm beneath her calm surface. Music was her language, the only way she could truly speak. But even music was often muffled by this enforced quietude, as if the school feared that sound beyond the stage would unravel the order they so desperately clung to. The door creaked open slightly, and Mira's freckled face appeared, her short curls catching the light. Their eyes met, a brief, charged moment where silence became a bridge instead of a barrier. Myra's expression was a mixture of defiance and understanding, a silent question hanging between them. How much longer could they endure this? How much longer would they let the silence consume them? Elara lifted her hand, a small, deliberate gesture, a nod, a sign of shared rebellion that needed no words. Mira smiled faintly and slipped inside, closing the door behind her gently. They sat together in the dim room, surrounded by shadows and the ghosts of music yet to be played. Minutes passed like hours, filled with the quiet hum of unspoken promises. Mira reached out, placing a light hand on Elara's wrist, steadying her trembling fingers. It was a gesture of courage, of alliance forged in the crucible of repression. Later, as Elara left the room, she encountered Professor Lyle in the hallway, a man whose stern presence was as much a part of the school as its ancient pianos. His gaze was piercing, yet behind his rigid exterior was a flicker of something unreadable, sympathy perhaps, or regret. Without a word, he inclined his head toward her, a subtle acknowledgement of her struggle. Elara returned the gesture with a small, grateful smile. No words were exchanged, but in that silent exchange, a fragile understanding passed between them. That night, by the flickering light of a candle, Elara took out her notebook. Her pen moved swiftly across the paper, her handwriting raw and urgent. She wrote of silences, the imposed and the innate, and the walls they built, both around herself and the institution she inhabited. Silence is not absence, she scribbled, but a space waiting to be filled. Her fingers trembled as she folded the note carefully and tucked it away, a secret seed planted in the fertile ground of her resolve. The muteness she had carried all her life no longer felt like a shackle but a lens, revealing the deeper silences that bound her and her peers. In the depths of the night, Elara lay awake, the quiet of the school pressing close. But within her, a melody began to rise, a song of defiance, fragile yet unyielding. She would find a way to break through the silence, to speak the truths that words could not capture, and to shatter the barriers that held them all captive. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risk and opposition. Yet for the first time, Elara felt the stirrings of something powerful, hope, and with it, the courage to challenge the silence that had so long defined her world. As dawn crept over the horizon, casting soft light across the silent halls, Elara rose with a steady breath and a heart that beat with quiet rebellion. The unvoiced truths within her would no longer be contained. The silence would be broken. Mira stood at the center of a small circle, her breath steady but her eyes bright with resolve. Around her gathered a handful of students, each keenly aware of the risk in their hushed meeting but drawn by the promise of change. She had chosen this hidden corner of the school, deliberately far from the prying eyes of faculty and the unforgiving ears of the silence enforcers. "We can't keep living like this," Mira said quietly, her voice a whisper that trembled only slightly with the weight of her words. "We're musicians, not statues. We need to find ways to speak, to connect, without breaking everything all at once." Her words rippled through the group. Some nodded eagerly. Others glanced nervously at the closed door, as if expecting it to burst open any second. But beneath the fear was a current of shared understanding. They all felt it, the suffocating grip of silence that stretched beyond mere rules into the very air they breathed. Elara lingered just beyond the circle, her presence barely noticeable. She watched Myra, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Her fingers hovered over the piano keys nearby, tapping out a silent rhythm only she could hear, a melody of quiet rebellion. Though mute by nature and bound by the same oppressive edict, Elara found an unexpected strength in Myra's courage. It was as if Myra's words had unlocked a door inside her, one that had been sealed shut by years of isolation and restraint. Theo was the first to break the silence that wasn't supposed to exist. His grin was mischievous, a spark of defiance lighting his eyes. "We'll need a way to communicate," he said, pulling a small piece of paper from his pocket and scribbling a quick note. With a sly glance around, he passed it to a fellow percussionist, who folded it carefully and tucked it into the lining of his jacket. The note was a seed, a whispered plan for discreet signs, coded gestures, and secret messages that could weave through the school's silent halls like an unseen song. It was a small act, but in the charged atmosphere, it felt revolutionary. Jasper stood apart from the group, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading light. His face was a mask of conflicted emotions, loyalty to tradition, fighting with a growing admiration for the quiet defiance blossoming around him. He wanted to believe in the school's ideals, but watching Elara and Mira stirred something restless inside him, a yearning he hadn't dared acknowledge. Elara caught his gaze briefly, and for a moment, something fragile passed between them, a silent promise of understanding and shared struggle. As the meeting dispersed, the students melted back into the shadows of the school, carrying with them the fragile flame of rebellion. It was a quiet revolt, born not of loud protests, but of whispered plans and shared glances. The silence rule still held, rigid and unyielding, but its foundations had begun to tremble. In the days that followed, small acts of defiance spread like ripples across a still pond. A glance held too long, a subtle gesture exchanged beneath the watchful eyes of the faculty, A note slipped between the pages of a music score. Each was a challenge, a crack in the wall of silence that imprisoned them. Elara found herself at the heart of this growing movement. Through her music, she spoke volumes, her fingers weaving melodies that carried the unspoken emotions of 1,000 silenced voices. And in the quiet spaces between the notes, she and Mira forged a bond stronger than words, a connection that promised something new. Yet, beneath the hopeful pulse of this quiet rebellion lurked the ever-present threat of discovery. Headmaster Corwin's shadow loomed large, his unwavering belief in silence as the bedrock of artistic purity a formidable barrier. The students knew the consequences of defiance could be severe, but the cost of continued silence felt even greater. As night fell over the school, Elara sat at the piano, the cool keys beneath her fingers a familiar comfort. She closed her eyes and let the music rise, a song of courage, of longing, of a fragile hope that refused to be silenced. Outside, the halls remained still, but inside, a revolution had begun. The question hung in the air, unspoken but urgent. How far would they go to reclaim their voices before the silence consumed them all? And as the first notes echoed softly into the night, Elara knew the answer would come, one chord at a time. Elara sat poised before the grand piano, her fingers hovering momentarily over the keys before descending in a delicate cascade of sound. The notes she played were soft, hesitant at first, but gradually grew with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room with an unspoken story. Jasper stood nearby, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed but his eyes fixed entirely on her. His usual guarded demeanor softened in the gentle light, revealing a glimmer of admiration and something more vulnerable beneath. Elara's music had always been her clearest form of communication, yet now, with Jasper's attentive presence, it felt as though each note was a bridge between two worlds, hers, shaped by silence and restraint, and his, bound by expectation and fear. She glanced up briefly, catching his gaze. There was an unspoken question in his eyes, a tentative invitation to cross a boundary neither had dared approach before. In the quiet that followed her final chord, Jasper stepped forward, hesitating as if weighing the risk of what he was about to do. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, folded piece of paper, extending it toward Elara. She took it carefully, the weight of the gesture heavier than any spoken phrase. Their eyes locked a moment, suspended in time, before he gave the faintest nod and retreated to the doorway, leaving her alone with the note. Elara unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The neat handwriting spelled out a simple message: "Meet me by the courtyard bench after rehearsal." Her heart quickened, a mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling inside her. The silence of the school suddenly felt less like a cage and more like a canvas waiting to be painted with new colors. Later, as the last echoes of students filing out faded into the evening, Elara made her way to the courtyard. The air was cool, scented faintly with blooming jasmine, and the dappled light from a fading sun created shifting patterns on the ground. Jasper was already there, seated on the worn wooden bench, his posture relaxed but his fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. They sat side by side, the distance between them shrinking with each passing moment. Words were forbidden, but their glances spoke volumes. The hesitation, the yearning, the quiet courage to reach out despite the risks. Elara offered a small smile, which Jasper returned with a softness that made the world seem a little less daunting. In that shared silence, they found an intimacy that transcended spoken language. Her fingers brushed lightly against the piano keys in her mind's eye, imagining the melodies that could express what their eyes and gestures could not. Jasper's hand twitched, almost reaching for hers, before he pulled back, caught between desire and the weight of the school's strictures. Back in her room later that night, Elara sat by the window, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows that danced across her notebook pages. She wrote furiously notes, thoughts, fragments of feelings she could not voice aloud. Jasper's presence lingered in her mind like a comforting shadow, a reminder that connection was possible even in a place built on silence. This chapter of her life, fragile and tentative, was a crossing of boundaries, not only between two people, but between the rules that sought to contain them and the yearning that refused to be silenced. As Elara closed her notebook and stared out into the star-speckled sky, a quiet resolve settled within her. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not alone, but with Jasper beside her. The silence of the school remained, heavy and ever-present, but it no longer felt absolute. Somewhere within its depths, a new melody was beginning to take shape, one of courage, connection, and the fragile hope that even the most rigid walls could be crossed. Students sat poised in their seats, their bodies taut with expectancy, eyes flickering between the polished black instrument and the figure seated before it. Elara's presence was a study in stillness. Delicate features framed by dark hair pulled back tightly, her observant eyes scanning the room with a calm that belied the storm within. Every breath she took was measured, every movement careful, as though she feared the silence might shatter at any moment. The school's sacred rule hung over them all like an invisible shroud. No speech, no whispers, no utterances outside of the concert hall. Yet, today felt different. The air was charged with unspoken tension, the kind that precedes a breaking point. Elara's fingers hovered above the keys, trembling ever so slightly. Mira sat nearby, her freckled face alight with a mix of nervous excitement and steadfast support. Jasper, his tall frame slightly slouched in tentative solidarity, glanced toward Elara with guarded hope. Even Sophie, perched at the edge, her sharp eyes darting, seemed momentarily silenced by the weight of what was about to unfold. Professor Lyle stood by the side, his stern visage softened by an undercurrent of sympathy. Across the room, Headmaster Corwin leaned against the wall, his silver hair catching the light, eyes piercing and unyielding. The room held its breath. Elara began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative whispers of melody that seemed to tremble in the stillness. But gradually, her hands grew bolder, the music swelling into a tempest of sound that filled every corner of the hall. Her body moved with the music, fingers dancing fiercely across the keys, communicating what words never could. Then, breaking the invisible barrier, Elara raised her hands in sweeping, fluid gestures. Her arms rose like waves, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the air, crafting a silent language that wove through the melody. Her gaze locked with Mira's, a silent conversation passing between them, threads of defiance, hope, and fragile connection. Mira's eyes sparkled with understanding, a subtle nod, the only acknowledgement they dared to exchange in the charged silence. Jasper's breath caught, the tension in his jaw betraying his inner turmoil. Sophie's lips parted in a silent gasp, her usual sharp confidence momentarily disarmed. Headmaster Corwin's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he took a step forward, breaking the spell. Professor Lyle's conflicted gaze flickered between Elara and Corwin, caught in the crossfire of duty and empathy. Murmurs began to ripple through the student body, a quiet thunder of awakening beneath the surface. The music reached its crescendo, Elara's gestures becoming more expressive, more urgent. She was no longer just playing notes. She was speaking through them, shattering the invisible walls built by silence. The room vibrated with raw emotion, frustration, longing, courage woven seamlessly into every chord. As the final note lingered in the charged air, Elara's hands fell still, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had dared to do. The room remained suspended, caught between shock and awe, tradition and change. In that charged moment, the school's foundations trembled. The silence rule, once inviolable, had been brokenly with words, but with a language far deeper. Elara's defiance was a spark, fragile yet fierce, igniting the first flickers of a revolution that none could now ignore. Headmaster Corwin's voice finally cut through the reverberations, cold and firm. "Elara, you know the rules. This is unacceptable." She met his gaze steadily, her eyes reflecting the music's fire. No words passed her lips, but the message was clear. This silence was no longer silence at all. The hall buzzed with tension. The line between order and upheaval blurred. Mira squeezed Elara's hand in quiet solidarity. Jasper's conflicted gaze softened, and even Professor Lyle allowed a flicker of reluctant respect. Outside, the corridors whispered with rumors and uncertainty. Sophie's sharp glances betrayed a mix of fear and excitement, while other students exchanged furtive looks that spoke of questions once unthinkable. Elara's breaking point had arrived, and with it, the possibility of a new melody, one not bound by silence, but enriched by the courage to be heard without words. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And in the heart of that silent hall, Elara sat, poised on the edge of change, ready to lead the first notes of a quiet revolution. Across the sprawling campus of the prestigious music school, whispers rippled like an undercurrent beneath the usual disciplined quiet. Elara moved through the halls as if through a storm's eye, her presence both igniting and absorbing the charged atmosphere around her. Students cast furtive glances, some filled with admiration, others with suspicion or unease. In the grand hall, where morning assemblies were held, murmurs swelled into low conversations. Clusters of students huddled in tight groups, voices hushed but urgent. The air was thick with speculation and tentative hope. Elara's defiant performance had shattered the long-standing silence rule, and the consequences were beginning to unfurl in subtle but unmistakable ways. Mira found her in the corner of the courtyard, her freckled face alight with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "You did it," she whispered, her eyes shining. "You showed them." Elara nodded slightly, her dark hair tied back neatly, eyes reflecting a cautious relief. The weight of silence that had so long pressed down on her chest felt marginally lighter, yet the unknowns ahead loomed large. Meanwhile, Headmaster Corwin sat alone in his office, the imposing room heavy with the scent of aged wood and polished brass. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that stretched across his desk, cluttered with scores and official papers. His silver hair caught the light as he turned slowly to face the photograph on the wall, a younger version of himself, fingers poised above a grand piano. His lips pressed into a thin line as memories stirred of passion and discipline, of control and sacrifice. The silence rule, once a symbol of purity and focus, now felt like a cage, constricting the very essence of artistry he sought to preserve. Yet, to admit this was to undermine the foundation of the institution he had dedicated his life to. In the hallways, Professor Lyle patrolled with his usual stern gaze, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of sympathy when they met Elara's. Across from him, Sophie, the ever-watchful flutist and purveyor of rumors, whispered accusations in the ear of curious students. The tension between authority and rebellion crackled quietly but persistently. Later that afternoon, Mira and Jasper met in a secluded corner beneath the ancient oaks lining the courtyard. Jasper's tall frame was tense, his usual guarded demeanor softened by the urgency in Mira's voice. "We can't let her stand alone," Mira insisted, her fingers entwined nervously. "If the faculty cracks down, it won't just be Elara who suffers. We all need to be ready." Jasper nodded slowly, the conflict within him evident, the desire to succeed within the system battling with the stirrings of courage inspired by Elara's defiance. "I'll do what I can," he said quietly, "but we need a plan." At the edge of campus, Professor Lyle intercepted Sophie in the corridor, his voice low but firm. "Enough with the rumors," he warned, his gaze sharp. "This isn't just idle gossip. It's tearing the school apart." Sophie's smirk faltered as she met his eyes, sensing the limits of her influence. The undercurrents of rebellion were shifting the balance of power in ways no one had anticipated. As evening fell, the school's grand auditorium remained empty but charged with the echoes of Elara's performance. The notes she had played, the unspoken truths conveyed through music and gesture lingered in the air like a promise and a challenge. Headmaster Corwin stood at the threshold of that silence, wrestling with the implications. Behind his stern exterior, a fragile seed of doubt took root, growing amidst the rigid structures of tradition and discipline. The aftershocks of Elara's defiance were only beginning to be felt, and the school, once a fortress of silence, stood on the brink of change. And somewhere deep inside Elara, beneath the layers of quiet and restraint, a fragile hope flickered, one that dared to believe in the possibility of connection beyond words, beyond silence. The question now hanging in the charged air was as clear as the first note of a new melody. How far would the school go to preserve its silence, and how much would it cost to break it? The answer would unfold in the days to come, shaped by courage, fear, and the enduring power of music. But for now, the halls were alive with whispers, and the chords of silence were trembling on the edge of transformation. Though voices remained forbidden, whispers of change fluttered like a delicate melody just beyond the walls. In a narrow practice room tucked beneath the grand concert hall, Mira leaned forward, her freckled face lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. Theo sat opposite her, fingers drumming rhythmically on the polished wood of the piano bench, their eyes locked in conspiratorial focus. "Elara needs us." Mira's lips moved silently, but her eyes spoke volumes. "We can't let her stand alone. If we show even a fraction of support, others might follow." Theo's grin was barely perceptible but full of warmth. "A chorus of quiet rebels," he seemed to say with a glance. They had been careful, each act of defiance measured and small, but together, these gestures coalesced into an invisible force gathering strength beneath the surface. Elsewhere, the atmosphere was heavier, burdened not by sound but by weighty decisions. Headmaster Corwin stood by his office window, the rain outside tracing erratic paths down the glass. His reflection fractured and distorted, mingling with the grey sky and stark trees beyond. The news of Elara's defiance had rippled through the school like a sudden storm, unsettling the carefully constructed order he had spent decades cultivating. He clenched his jaw, the familiar ache in his chest reminding him of nights spent at the piano, fingers demanding precision and silence. Yet, something about this quiet rebellion gnawed at him, not just as a challenge to authority, but as a challenge to his own beliefs. Was the silence truly a sanctuary, or had it become a prison? In the hushed expanse of the music hall after hours, Elara sat alone at the grand piano. Her delicate fingers traced the keys, coaxing a melancholic melody that drifted through the empty seats like a whispered secret. Each note was a piece of her unspoken self, a fragile thread woven through the vast silence. The hall was vast and cold, yet in this solitude there was a tentative courage, a quiet defiance embodied in every chord. The day's events had brought a flicker of warmth amid the isolation. Mira and Theo's support had reminded her she was not entirely alone. Yet the weight of the silence rule pressed on her, the invisible walls still looming large. In a quieter hallway, Professor Lyle moved with his usual measured steps, his stern expression softened by a glance toward Myra, who waited anxiously nearby. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, a subtle nod passed between them. It spoke of understanding and unspoken support, a fragile solidarity that dared not voice itself openly. Professor Lyle was a man torn between duty and empathy. Though he enforced the silence rule with unwavering discipline, he recognized the emotional cost it inflicted. His gesture toward Myra was small but significant, an acknowledgement that beneath the rigidity there were fissures where change might seep through. Across the school, these delicate threads of alliance wove an intricate pattern, fragile yet promising. Students and faculty alike began to reconsider the rigid boundaries that had governed their lives. Some remained hesitant, their fear of repercussions anchoring them to tradition, but others felt the stirrings of something new. The balance was precarious. Each act of support risked discovery and punishment. Yet the growing network of quiet rebellion was a testament to the human desire for connection and expression. Elara's courage had sparked a movement not defined by loud proclamations, but by shared glances, coded gestures, and the resonant power of music itself. As evening shadows lengthened, the school seemed to hold its breath, suspended between the old world and the possibility of change. The alliances forged in these fragile moments carried the weight of hope and the threat of upheaval, a testament to the enduring tension between silence and sound, isolation and community. And at the heart of it all was Elara, her music a beacon in the darkness, her silence speaking louder than words ever could. The question lingered in the air. Would these fragile alliances be enough to challenge the formidable walls of tradition, or would the silence swallow them whole? The answer would come, note by note, in the days ahead. In the dimly lit practice room, the faint glow of the evening sun filtered through tall windows, casting elongated shadows that danced softly across the polished floor. Elara's music was a fragile thread weaving through the silence, an unspoken language that spoke louder than words ever could. Myra sat nearby, her gaze fixed on Elara's hands as they moved with a grace that belied the turmoil beneath. Theo leaned against the doorway, tapping a quiet rhythm on the wooden frame, his smile subtle but sincere. Around them, the oppressive weight of the school's silence rule felt, for a moment, less suffocating. It was in these fleeting moments that a seed began to take root, a silent chorus growing not through spoken words, but through shared glances, tentative gestures, and the unifying power of music. Elara's performances, once solitary expressions of her inner world, had become a beacon for others who felt the sting of isolation. Students who had long endured the rigid discipline of silence found themselves drawn together, their collective yearning weaving a tapestry of quiet rebellion. In the hallways, whispers were replaced by exchanged looks, subtle nods that carried volumes. Mira, ever the empathetic rebel, moved among her peers like a gentle spark, encouraging those who hesitated to embrace this new form of connection. Her freckles seemed to brighten with each small victorious smile here, a shared understanding there. To her, Elara's music was more than notes. It was a lifeline, a way to break the invisible chains that bound them. Theo's laughter, usually a balm to the tense atmosphere, had taken on a new resonance. Though he remained the class clown, his support for Elara was unwavering, offering a quiet strength that bolstered the fragile community forming beneath the surface. Jasper, meanwhile, watched from afar, his guarded demeanor slipping in moments when Elara's melodies touched something deep within him. Their relationship, a delicate dance of unspoken feelings and cautious hope, mirrored the broader struggle unfolding within the school. One afternoon, as Elara packed her sheet music, Mira approached her with a sly grin. "They're starting to notice," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the hush. "The way students linger longer in the hallways, how they pause near the practice rooms, it's changing." Elara nodded, a faint smile ghosting her lips. Her music was no longer just her refuge. It had become a quiet revolution. Later that week, the school corridors buzzed with a new energy. Groups of students gathered in shadowed corners, sharing secret smiles and subtle signals. The oppressive silence that once defined them was fracturing, replaced by a tentative hope. Elara watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and apprehension. The risks were real, the faculty's watchful eyes, the ever-present threat of punishment, but the possibility of change was intoxicating. The silent chorus was growing, and with it, the promise of a future where expression could flourish beyond the confines of enforced quiet. As Elara's music filled the school once more, it was not just a melody, but a manifesto, a call to embrace the power of connection, even in the absence of words. The chapter closed on a note of fragile harmony, the subtle revolution taking shape in the shared silences and resonant chords of a community daring to dream beyond their imposed limits. And in Elara's eyes, that fragile hope shone brighter than ever, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find voice even in silence. Outside, the sprawling grounds of the prestigious music school lay bathed in the soft hues of twilight, the sky a canvas of muted purples and blues that seemed almost to muffle the world beneath it. Corwin stood by the wide window, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light, his piercing silver eyes scanning the quiet courtyards where students once moved like ghosts, their lips sealed by the institution's sacred edict. Tonight, the silence felt different, heavier, almost accusatory. For a long moment, Corwin allowed himself to be swallowed by the stillness. The rule he had upheld with unwavering conviction for decades, the rule that forbade any verbal communication outside the concert halls, had been his life's work. It was, in his eyes, the crucible of artistic purity, the invisible string that bound discipline to creativity. Yet, recent events had begun to erode that certainty. The defiance of Elara, the quiet rebellion of Myra, and the subtle shifts in the student body had all whispered to him that this silence, once a virtue, might now be a cage. In the solitude of his office, Corwin's mind drifted back to a time when his own passion for music had ignited his soul. He saw himself as a young man, fingers flying over the keys of a grand piano, the audience enraptured by the torrents of sound he could conjure. That music was his voice, his sanctuary, much like it was for Elara. But as the applause faded, the weight of expectation had pressed down on him, shaping him into the austere guardian of tradition he had become. Discipline was paramount. Emotion was to be channeled, never unleashed. Yet, beneath the stern mask, a flicker of doubt had begun to grow. Had his rigid enforcement of silence strangled more than just idle chatter? Had it silenced the very spirit it sought to protect? The knock at his door was soft but insistent. Corwin turned, his expression unreadable as Myra stepped inside, followed by Theo. Myra's freckles caught the dim light, her short curly hair framing a face set with determined hope. Theo's grin was mischievous, yet there was a seriousness in his eyes that belied his usual levity. "We wanted to talk, sir," Myra began quietly, placing a small folded paper on Corwin's desk. Theo nodded, standing beside her like a silent sentinel. Corwin unfolded the paper slowly. The manifesto was handwritten, simple, earnest. It spoke of the need for freedom, for expression beyond the constraints of silence. It was a call for understanding, for a new harmony between tradition and change. He looked up, meeting Myra's steady gaze. In that moment, the unyielding walls he had built around his beliefs trembled. "You believe this will change things?" he asked, his voice low, almost vulnerable. Myra nodded. "We think it must. For all of us." Corwin placed the manifesto down, his mind racing through decades of memories and principles. The echoes of change had begun to stir within him, challenging the foundation of the silence he had so fiercely guarded. As the night deepened, the headmaster found himself at a crossroads, not just for the school, but for himself. Could he embrace this quiet revolution without losing the essence of the music he loved? Could the chords of silence be rewritten to allow new melodies to emerge? Outside, the stars blinked awake, distant yet constant. Inside, a fragile hope took root, its first notes tentative yet unmistakable. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in many years, Corwin felt the stirring of possibility, a promise that even the strictest silence might one day sing with new life. And so, in the stillness of his office, the echoes of change began to sound. Elara sat alone at the piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys. The familiar coldness of the ivory beneath her touch, an anchor in the sea of uncertainty that churned within her chest. Each note she imagined was a silent note, a wordless melody that carried the weight of her unsaid thoughts and emotions. She breathed in the stillness, the kind that the school so rigidly enforced, but inside her a tempest was gathering. For months, the silence rule had been an invisible chain around the students' lives, binding them to a discipline that forbade even the slightest whisper beyond the concert stage. Yet Elara's muteness had made this rule a double imprisonment. Where others could at least speak in hushed tones, Elara's voice had always been locked away, leaving her emotions to swell in the quiet spaces between her thoughts. But now, something was shifting. The music she played was no longer just a refuge, but a language, a tool for rebellion and expression beyond the school's suffocating edict. Myra was waiting outside the practice room, pacing softly on the thick carpet. When Elara finally emerged, their eyes met, a silent conversation passing between them that needed no words. Myra's freckled face lit with a small, conspiratorial smile. She had been the first to see the spark in Elara's determined gaze, the quiet promise that this time the silence would be broken. Together they moved through the corridors, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of Professor Lyle, whose strict enforcement of the silence rule was both a source of fear and, secretly, of sympathy. His conflicted presence lingered in the hallways like a shadow, reminding them of the risks they were about to take. In the rehearsal hall, Jasper was already there, seated quietly in the back row. His tall frame was tense, his hands folded tightly in his lap. When Elara approached, a flicker of warmth crossed his guarded expression. His support, though reserved, was a lifeline. The emotional barriers between them were thick, built from years of expectations and unspoken fears. But in this moment, the possibility of connection shimmered faintly, like a fragile chord waiting to be struck. The day of the concert arrived with a suffocating stillness. The audience filled the seats in the grand auditorium, their faces a blur of anticipation and unspoken curiosity. Backstage, Headmaster Corwin stood with his arms crossed, his silver hair catching the light like a crown of authority. His piercing eyes scanned the performers with a mixture of pride and unease. The silence rule was his sacred charge, a tradition he had upheld with unwavering conviction. Yet, beneath his austere exterior, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. Elara's quiet defiance was no longer a secret, and the echoes of her rehearsed melodies had unsettled the order he cherished. As the lights dimmed, Elara took her place at the piano. The spotlight felt like a pulse, steady and insistent, drawing her into a space where silence and sound collided. Her fingers began to move, not just playing notes, but weaving a story of longing, courage, and fragile hope. With every chord, she communicated what words could not, breaking down the walls of isolation that had long defined the school's culture. Mira's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she watched her friend transform the silence into a chorus of emotion. Jasper's breath caught, the tension in his body easing as he allowed himself to feel the unspoken connection between them. Even Headmaster Corwin, in the shadows of the wings, found himself caught in the music's spell, the rigid lines of his face softened by the unexpected power of Elara's expression. The concert hall, once a temple of silence, became the stage for a quiet revolution. Elara's performance was a declaration, a breaking of the silence that had bound them all. The music spoke volumes where words had failed, and as the final note lingered, the audience sat in stunned reverence, the weight of the moment settling over them like a shared secret. Backstage, the echoes of applause began to swell, but Elara remained still, her heart pounding with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and resistance, but for the first time, the sound of change hummed through the halls of the music schooler, melody of hope and defiance that no silence could ever contain. As the curtain fell, Elara's eyes met Myra's once more, a silent promise passing between them. The journey was far from over, but the first chord had been struck, and in that fragile harmony, a new story was beginning to unfold. Outside the hall, whispers began to spread, the ripple of Elara's courage reaching even the most distant corners of the school. The tension between tradition and transformation hung thick in the air. But beneath it all, a pulse of possibility beat strong. What would come next was unknown, but one thing was certain: the silence had been broken. Rows of seats were filled with the school's faculty, students, and a select audience of patrons and alumni, all gathered to witness the evening's performance, a culmination of months of preparation and unspoken tension. Elara stepped onto the stage with quiet determination, her delicate frame silhouetted against the rich velvet curtain. Her dark hair was tied back with precision, revealing the subtle intensity in her observant eyes. She moved with a grace that belied the storm of emotions roiling beneath her calm exterior. The silence in the hall was absolute, a heavy cloak that pressed upon everyone present, echoing the very rule that had shaped Elara's life at the school. No speech outside the concert hall. Settling at the grand piano, she allowed her fingers to hover momentarily above the keys. The audience leaned in, sensing the tremor of vulnerability that accompanied such a poised beginning. Then, with a breath deeper than any spoken word, Elara plunged into the music. Her hands danced across the keys with extraordinary skill, conjuring waves of sound that surged and receded like the tides. Each note was a brushstroke, painting the landscape of her silent soul, longing, frustration, hope, and defiance intertwined in a tapestry of sound. As the piece unfolded, Elara began to transcend the boundaries of music alone. She introduced gestures, subtle at first, a slight arch of her back, a raised hand, but soon these movements became more pronounced. A clenched fist lifted defiantly towards the ceiling. A sweeping motion of her arms spoke of barriers broken and chains loosened. These non-verbal expressions were an act of rebellion, a language more profound than any spoken phrase could convey in a place where words were forbidden. The audience's reaction was electric, yet divided. Some were mesmerized, their eyes wide with wonder as they witnessed the fusion of sound and silent storytelling. Others shifted uneasily in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. At the front, Headmaster Corwin sat rigidly, his silver hair catching the light as his piercing eyes bore into Elara with a mixture of authority and incredulity. His lifelong commitment to the silence rule felt challenged as never before. Backstage, Myra's heart pounded in her chest. She had been Elara's steadfast ally, encouraging these small acts of defiance. Tonight, that support felt heavier, charged with the weight of consequences yet to be faced. Jasper stood nearby, his tall figure tense. His usual guardedness cracked ever so slightly, revealing the inner turmoil of a young man torn between loyalty to tradition and admiration for Ilaros' courage. Theo, the class clown, offered a subtle nod of encouragement, his warm smile a beacon in the fraught atmosphere. Sophie, once the relentless school gossip, was strangely silent. The usual sharpness of her expression softened into stunned disbelief. The climax of Elara's performance came with a breathtaking crescendo, where the music swelled to fill every corner of the hall. Her gestures grew more commanding, a silent manifesto that resonated deeply with those willing to listen beyond the constraints of the imposed silence. The final note hung in the air, a delicate thread connecting performer and audience in a moment of shared vulnerability. For a heartbeat, the hall was still. No applause, no whispers, only the fragile echo of music and the weight of what had been witnessed. Then, slowly, hesitantly, hands began to clap. The sound grew, spreading like wildfire, until it became a roar of approval and awe. Elara rose from the piano, her gaze sweeping over the faces bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers. In her eyes gleamed a silent plea for understanding, for change, for connection. As the applause washed over her, Elara felt the tremor of a new beginning. The silence rule had been broken, not with words, but with the universal language of music and gesture. The school, its traditions, and its people were poised at the edge of transformation. Yet beneath the triumph lay the question that would haunt the days to come. How would the school's guardians of tradition respond? Would they embrace this fragile hope, or would they tighten the grip of silence once more? The answer hung in the charged air, awaiting the next note in this unfolding symphony of change. Ilara's final notes still echoed faintly in the air, a lingering resonance that refused to be silenced. The audience sat frozen for a heartbeat, caught between disbelief and awe, before the murmurs began soft at first, then swelling into a chorus of whispers that rippled through the crowd like a gathering storm. Students exchanged glances heavy with unspoken questions. Some faces glowed with admiration, others tightened with disapproval. Faculty members stood rigid, their eyes flickering with a mixture of shock and calculation. Headmaster Corwin's stern countenance was the eye of this storm, his presence commanding yet seemingly distant. A pall of uncertainty descended upon the room, as if the very foundation of the school had shuddered under Ilaros' music and her silent rebellion. Outside the hall, in the dim corridors, groups of students clustered in hushed conversations. Myra's freckled face shone with a spark that had not been there before, her eyes bright with the thrill of possibility. Jasper remained quieter, his guarded expression betraying the internal conflict between fear and hope. Theo, ever the light-hearted spirit, cracked a rare, serious smile as he whispered a wordless salute to Elara's courage. In the solitude of his office, Headmaster Corwin stood by the window, the city's fading light casting long shadows across his austere features. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he wrestled with the storm Elara had unleashed. The silence he had so fiercely guarded now felt fragile, its edges blurred by the raw emotion that her performance had laid bare. For the first time, doubt seeped into his conviction. Was the discipline he had imposed truly fostering artistry, or merely burying the human heart beneath layers of repression? The following days were charged with tension. Faculty meetings became battlegrounds of ideology, voices raised in heated debate over the future of the silence rule. Professor Lyle, the strict but secretly sympathetic instructor, found himself caught between loyalty to tradition and empathy for Elaros' cause. Sophie, the school gossip, circulated rumors that deepened divides, while others sought ways to bridge the growing rift. Amid the turbulence, Elara retreated to the courtyard, the quiet space offering a fragile refuge. Mira and Jasper found her there, their approach tentative but resolute. Mira's warm smile and Jasper's steady gaze spoke volumes in the absence of words. Together, they formed a fragile alliance, small cluster of hope amid uncertainty. As conversations spread through classrooms and practice rooms, the ripple effect of Elara's defiance became undeniable. The once unbreakable silence now held cracks through which new melodies of connection and understanding threatened to emerge. The school, steeped in tradition, stood at the cusp of transformation, its future uncertain but undeniably altered. Elara, seated beneath the fading sunlight, felt the weight of countless unspoken emotions pressing upon her. Yet within that pressure stirred a quiet flamer, yearning not just to be heard, but to awaken others from their silent slumber. The journey ahead was daunting, fraught with resistance and risk, but also rich with the fragile promise of change. As the chapter closes, the school community stands poised between the echoes of the past and the uncertain harmonies of a new dawn. The chords of silence now vibrating with a fresh, tentative resonance that refuses to be ignored. Myra stood near the center, her short curly hair catching the light as she leaned forward, speaking in a low but unwavering tone. Around her, students sat in a loose semicircle, some nodding, others biting their lips thoughtfully. A few faculty members lingered at the edges, their expressions a blend of curiosity and guarded skepticism. "We have lived under this silence for so long," Myra began, her voice steady despite the tension that hummed beneath the surface. "But silence, when forced, is not purity, it is repression. It stifles the very music we are meant to create." Her words resonated with many. Among the listeners was Jasper, who had quietly taken a seat beside her, his tall, neatly dressed figure slightly hunched forward in attention. His guarded demeanor softened as he caught Elara's eye from across the room. Elara, seated apart yet fully present, felt a flutter of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks' hope. The discussions Myra and Jasper had initiated over the past days were beginning to take root. They had organized small gatherings like this one, spaces where students and a handful of faculty could speak without fear of reprimand. These conversations were tentative, often interrupted by doubts and reminders of the school's strict traditions, but they were conversations nonetheless. Meanwhile, down the shadowed hallways, Jasper found himself standing before Headmaster Corwin's imposing office door. The tall, austere man with silver hair and piercing eyes looked up as Jasper entered, surprise flickering across his face Mr. Jasper, Corwin said, his voice crisp but not unkind. To what do I owe the pleasure? Jasper swallowed, steadying his nerves. Sir, I wanted to speak about the silence rule, he began carefully. I believe some of us are feeling constrained, not just by the rule itself, but by what it means for our music and our community. Corwin's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gestured for Jasper to continue. Perhaps there is a way to balance discipline with expression, to find a middle ground that honors tradition but allows for growth. The headmaster was silent for a long moment, the weight of his past ambitions and the institution's legacy pressing down on him. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with years of responsibility. Change is not easily welcomed here, Jasper, but I will consider your words. Back in the common room, the air was thick with charged energy. Elara observed the dialogue unfolding, the mixture of voices weaving a tapestry of cautious optimism. For the first time in a long while, she felt the invisible walls around her begin to ripple. Professor Lyle stood apart from the group, near a tall window. The late afternoon light struck his face, highlighting the furrows of thought etched into his brow. He had enforced the silence rule for years, yet watching the students' earnest discussions stirred a conflicted sympathy within him. Perhaps the rigidity he upheld was a barrier, not a bridge. As the meeting drew to a close, Myra's gaze swept across the room, resting briefly on Elara. No words passed between them, but the silent acknowledgement was enough. A fragile seed had been planted. Outside, the evening sky deepened to a velvety indigo, the first stars beginning to twinkle. The currents of change stirred quietly beneath the surface of the school, promising that tomorrow would not be the same as today. And somewhere in that stillness, Elara's fingers itched to compose, to speak through the language she knew best: music. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was brimming with possibility. The following days saw the ripple effect of these conversations spread like a gentle tide. Students whispered in hallways, sharing ideas and dreams. Myra and Jasper became informal leaders, bridging gaps and building alliances. Even some faculty members tentatively voiced their thoughts, emboldened by the shifting atmosphere. Elara found herself drawn into this growing movement, her silent presence a quiet but potent symbol of the power of nonverbal communication. With each passing moment, the old walls of silence cracked, letting in light and sound in ways previously forbidden. Yet, shadows lingered. Headmaster Corwin remained a formidable presence, his internal struggle palpable. Could he relinquish the control he so fiercely protected without fracturing the foundation of the school? As night fell once more, the music school held its breath, poised on the edge of transformation. The chords of silence were beginning to shift, their resonance carrying a new, fragile harmony. The question that remained was whether this fragile harmony would sustain or shatter under the weight of tradition and fear. Elara closed her eyes, feeling the vibrations of possibility hum beneath her skin. The silence was no longer just a rule, it was a canvas, waiting for the first bold stroke of change, and she was ready to paint. Sunlight poured through the towering windows, casting long golden beams that danced across polished wooden floors and illuminated faces, each etched with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and hope. At the front, beneath the school's ancient crest, Headmaster Corwin stood alone at the podium. His silver hair caught the light, and, for the first time in months, his stern gaze softened with a hint of vulnerability. The murmurs that had filled the room moments before subsided as Corwin cleared his throat. His voice, steady but low, carried across the hushed crowd. "Today marks a turning point," he began, his words measured but sincere. "The silence that has defined us, The discipline that has shaped our art must now be reconsidered, not abandoned, but transformed. A ripple passed through the students seated in rows, some exchanging glances, others sitting straighter, as if the very air had shifted. Elara sat quietly among them, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her lap. The weight she had carried, the isolation, the unspoken frustrations, felt lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves were beginning to breathe. Mira, sitting just a few seats away, caught Elara's eye and smiled, a spark of shared triumph flickering between them. It was a smile that said, without words, that their quiet rebellion had not been in vain. Somewhere across the hall, Theo leaned against a pillar, his usual playful grin subdued but hopeful. Professor Lyle's stern face softened as he watched the scene unfold, a silent acknowledgement of the change that was coming. Corwin continued, outlining a new pilot program that would allow students to express themselves through limited verbal and nonverbal communication in designated common areas. The rule, once ironclad, would bend to accommodate the human need for connection and emotional expression. The announcement was met with a mixture of applause and cautious whispers, the beginning of a dialogue long overdue. After the assembly, the corridors buzzed with tentative excitement. Jasper approached Elara, his usual guarded demeanor replaced by something more open. "I think this is a good thing," he said softly, his voice barely breaking the silence that had defined their world. Elara met his gaze, feeling the fragile threads of trust weaving between them. It was a moment charged with possibility, a tentative step toward breaking down the barriers that had kept them apart. Meanwhile, in a sunlit practice room, Professor Lyle and Theo discussed plans for a new rehearsal space where students could experiment freely with music, movement, and expression. Their laughter echoed gently down the hall, a sound as refreshing as a breeze after a long winter. It was a small but significant act of defiance, a promise that the school's future would hold space for both tradition and innovation. Elara found herself walking through the now familiar halls with a renewed sense of purpose. The silence that had once felt suffocating now hummed with potential. She imagined the melodies yet to be played, the stories yet to be told, not just through her piano, but through the shared language of glances, gestures, and music that transcended words. The path ahead was uncertain. The old rules would not disappear overnight, and many would resist the change. Yet, in this moment, as the day faded into a soft twilight, the school breathed a new melody, one composed of hope, courage, and the fragile harmony of a community learning to listen beyond silence. Elara paused beneath an arched doorway, her dark eyes reflecting the glowing horizon. Somewhere deep inside, a song began to rise, quiet, persistent chord that promised a future where sound and silence could coexist, where voices could be heard in myriad forms, and where connection would no longer be confined by rigid rules. The first notes of this new melody had been struck, and in their resonance lay the promise of transformation. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Elara felt the music of change stirring within her and within them all. The silence between them was not the oppressive quiet of the school halls, but a shared, gentle pause, an unspoken dialogue between two souls who understood the weight of words withheld and the power of presence alone. Myra's freckled face was illuminated by a shy smile, her short curls catching the light as she glanced toward Elara. Though neither spoke, their eyes conveyed a fragile hope, an acknowledgement of the small victories won against silence's tyranny. The crisp air carried the faint scent of damp earth and aging paper from the nearby library, grounding Elara in the moment, reminding her of the world beyond the strict boundaries she had always known. As they rose to leave, Elara felt a warmth radiate from Myra's steady gaze, a quiet encouragement that had become a lifeline in the midst of isolation. Their friendship, forged in the crucible of restraint, had blossomed into a sanctuary where Elara could breathe without the fear of judgment. This sanctuary, however delicate, was a beacon guiding her toward something she had long denied herself: connection. Later, beneath the dim glow of the music hall's chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and fading candle wax, Jasper hesitated at the edge of the rehearsal space. His tall frame was tense, the neat lines of his attire belying the turmoil beneath. Ilaros's fingers hovered over the keys of the grand piano, her eyes closed as she prepared to begin. The room held its breath, the silence pregnant with anticipation. Minutes stretched before Jasper made his move. With a subtle, trembling motion, he reached out, his hand finding Elara's with a tentative assurance that spoke volumes beyond words. Their fingers intertwined, a silent pledge of trust and vulnerability that shattered the invisible walls between them. The music began a delicate, haunting melody that wove through the space like a fragile thread binding to hesitant hearts. Each note was a word unspoken, each pause a breath shared in unison. Around them, the audience of empty seats seemed to lean in, witnesses to a quiet defiance that challenged the school's rigid doctrine. In the study room, Theo's light-hearted drumming on the desk injected a burst of energy into the otherwise tense atmosphere. His rhythmic taps echoed like a heartbeat, breaking through the lingering shadows of doubt and fear. Elara glanced up, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as Theo's antics drew a few more from their solitary reveries. The camaraderie was fragile but genuine, a testament to the shifting tides within the school's walls. Even in the midst of uncertainty, moments of joy and levity had begun to pierce the silence. From the doorway, Professor Lyle observed the scene, his expression unreadable but softened by a rare glint of approval. He had long been the enforcer of silence, a guardian of rules that now seemed less absolute. Watching Elara's progress, her resilience, her courage, her ability to forge connections through music and gesture, had stirred something within him. With a subtle nod, he acknowledged not just her talent, but her bravery, signaling a cautious optimism that change might be possible after all. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the school settled into its usual quiet, Elara sat alone at the piano. Her fingers traced the keys slowly, hesitating before unleashing a melody that was both a farewell and a promise. It was a song of fragile harmony, of broken barriers mended with patience, of voices finding strength in silence, and of a girl who dared to dream of a world where sound and silence could coexist in delicate balance. As the final notes faded into the night, Elara opened her eyes to the darkness, feeling not emptiness, but a sparker, fragile but enduring hope that she was no longer alone. The journey was far from over, but for the first time the chords of silence seemed to sing a new song, one of courage, connection, and the quiet revolution of the heart. The chapter closes on Elara's thoughtful gaze out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance like stars guiding her toward an uncertain but promising future. The fragile harmony she has nurtured within herself and her circle of friends stands. As both a victory and a challenge can, this delicate balance hold against the forces that still resist change. The question lingers, inviting the reader to turn the page and witness the unfolding transformation. Elara sat poised at the piano, her delicate fingers hovering briefly above the keys. A breath caught in the stillness around her. The silence that once had felt suffocating now felt different, softer, as if it had been reshaped by the music, by the courage that had grown in the hearts of those who listened. She closed her eyes, recalling the countless hours spent in this very hall. Her music, the only language she could wield freely. The notes she would play today were not simply melodies. They were a testament to the journey she had embarked on, from isolation to connection, from reluctant compliance to bold defiance. Every chord, every pause, was infused with the unspoken emotions she had carried so long within her. Behind her, the audience was quiet but present. Among them stood Headmaster Corwin, his tall, austere frame unmistakable. His silver hair caught the light, and his piercing eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, held a new softness. For the first time, Elara saw in his expression a flicker of understanding, a recognition of the pain and beauty intertwined in her music. His nod was slight but deliberate, an unspoken truce between the old order and the new. Across the hall, Mira sat with her violin resting gently on her lap, her freckled face alight with a smile that held the warmth of solidarity. Nearby, Jasper's guarded demeanor had softened. His eyes met hers briefly, a silent exchange that spoke volumes about the barriers they were slowly dismantling. They had come so far from tentative glances and whispered questions to moments of fragile intimacy that defied the strict silence once enforced upon them. As Elara's fingers began to move, the first notes filled the space, clear, resonant, alive. The music spoke of longing and hope, of struggle and triumph. It wove through the hall like a river, touching each listener with a gentle yet undeniable force. The students, once bound by rigid rules that forbade speech, now found themselves united in this shared experience, their eyes bright with the possibility of connection beyond words. Theo stood nearby, his usual light-hearted presence, a quiet anchor amidst the swelling emotions. He exchanged a knowing look with Professor Lyle, whose stern exterior had always concealed a conflicted loyalty. The mentor's gaze lingered on Elara, pride mingling with a tentative hope that the school could indeed evolve. When the final chord lingered and faded into the stillness, a silence unlike any before stretched out, a silence pregnant with promise rather than oppression. Slowly, the crowd began to shift, exchanging glances and smiles, their gestures no longer restrained but open and genuine. It was a communion forged not just through sound, but through understanding, courage, and shared vulnerability. Elara rose from the piano, her heart swelling with a fragile joy. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the balance between tradition and change delicate. Yet, within this moment, in the chords of silence and the echoes of music, a new melody had begun, one that would carry the school forward, blending the sacred with the human, the silent with the spoken. As she stepped forward to join her friends, Elara felt the weight of isolation lift, replaced by a quiet but unyielding hope, a promise that even in silence there could be connection, and in restraint, liberation. The music school, once a place of rigid silence, now hummed softly with the vibrant possibility of a new dawn. And as the doors of the hall opened to the evening air, the soft murmur of voices began to rise, tentative, careful, but unmistakably real. The sound of a community learning to speak in the language of hearts, beyond words. The chords of silence had been struck, and their resonance would carry far beyond the walls of this place, echoing in the lives of all who dared to listen and to dream.